Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing story. What if Deku was a necromancer? This amazing story was written by Magnus9284. Please support them. Don't forget to like, sub, and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. A sinister bond. Katsuki Bakugo stared balefully at the double-wide door set in the wall before him. Hopefully, this time, he'd be able to stay in the room behind it for the rest of the month without any issues. This was going to be his third time changing rooming partners, but only the first where he'd been the one forced to change rooms. Admittedly, the first time he'd been assigned a new roomie, it hadn't been his fault at all. He'd even considered the extra he'd been originally paired with somewhat tolerable. Of course, that might have been because the fat tub of lard's only problem was he completely believed himself to be the second coming of some long-dead pop star named MJ. But even Katsuki had been forced to admit, with a quirk like voice mimicry, old Tubby certainly had been able to field a voice to match his delusion. If only he hadn't insisted on always flashing idiotic smiles all the time. It had seemed like the explosive blonde had been the only one surprised when a stranger had come in one day, flashed some ID, signed Fat MJ out for a day on account of good behavior, and then never returned. The staff had seemed to expect such an incident, though, and while the authorities were hunting down their kidnapped patient, he'd been left a roommate short. It hadn't been a full day before he'd been assigned a new partner. His second roommate's departure did actually have something to do with him, but Katsuki refused to feel guilty about it. After all, who'd feel comfortable sharing a room at a mental institution with not only one of their old classmates from middle school, but also one that had been their stooge and fellow enforcer of the pecking order? And it wasn't like Yubio Nagaki revealing he'd been incarcerated after being convicted of committing multiple counts of public perversion had helped at all. Frankly, the blonde had found his old underling's sob story of being under the effects of drugs at the time laughable, the vehement insistence that a third party had added said drugs to his soda even more so. Still, the way Nagaki had wiggled his fingers, no longer elongated due to the bracers they both wore, every time he recounted the story, or even mentioned girls, gave Katsuki the creeps, not that he'd ever admit to such. Yes, there'd been no doubt in the explosive blonde's mind that his former schoolmate sycophant was nowhere near as innocent as he claimed. It had taken a few harshly whispered words, carefully out of sight of any of the staff, but Katsuki had quickly managed to convince Nagaki to request a transfer to a different room. How was he supposed to have known the pervert would straight up demand to be paired with a girl? The rather aggressive way the brunette had gone about it hadn't been his idea either, but it had had the creep gone faster than intended. The third, "Don't worry, kid. You won't have to worry about going through the same thing as last time with this one," Katsuki's handler said, attempting to reassure the blonde as gently and kindly a man of his immense size possibly could. For once, the soft words of the large man did little to calm the fraying nerves of his ward, which was saying something, as the giant had been appointed Katsuki's handler since the day he'd brought the explosive blonde to the institution. Oddly enough, that had somehow translated into him being the only staff member their newest patient even halfway listened to voluntarily. "I'll even stand outside, right here, if it makes you feel better. This time, if the bracers go red, you won't get zapped." Not like before. The additional reassurance hardly helped at all. Katsuki's last assigned roommate had been a rapist. It had come as a surprise, not only to the blonde, but also to the entirety of the staff of the institution. It definitely hadn't been the reason Shujukiyama had been admitted, and he wouldn't have been allowed in at all if they'd known. The slightly older teen hadn't come off as threatening in the beginning, though. In fact, Jukiyama had gone out of his way to be polite when Katsuki had first met him, showering praises upon the blonde for his well-built physique and aura of masculine strength. There'd even been compliments about how he smelled. But that very same night, it hadn't been compliments the fucker had wanted to give him. Katsuki had snapped awake the instant the freak had tried to crawl into his smallish bed, prompting the blonde's self-defense instincts to immediately crank into overdrive. Unaware of the trigger at the time, security had burst into the room seconds later, zapping him with enough volts to cause his muscles to seize. His bracers had gone red when he'd attempted to activate his quirk. Fortunately, his room's camera had been equipped with night vision, and video recording proved he'd been in real danger. The incident had been withheld from his records completely. Jukiyama had been immediately transferred to an actual prison, and as an apology by the staff, Katsuki had been given the choice to be moved to a new room with another new partner. Needless to say, he'd taken the offer. Anything to get out of his old room and the shit that seemed to dog him there. This one better not be another degenerate Bokamona. Katsuki muttered as he reluctantly gave a nod, chuckling good-naturedly at the nickname his charge still insisted on referring to him by. The handler Bo promptly activated the double-wide doors. "You've got a new roommate," Bo announced to the occupant within as the door opened, not peeking inside, merely shouting around the corner. "At least try not to scare this one, yeah?" Katsuki took a moment to pull in a calming breath. Able to use his quirk or not, he was still tough enough to take care of himself here, no matter who he was stuck with. That raping bastard's busted-up face was proof enough of that. Having centered himself, the explosive blonde stepping inside his new room. A second later, he quite literally leapt right back out. "There's a girl in there," Katsuki shouted, failing to hide his obvious panic. "And she's naked. What the hell, Bokamona?" Porcelain skin, chin-length white hair, deadened icy blue eyes, and modestly sized breasts. The explosive blonde knew even as he was freaking out that the sight he'd unintentionally ogled would be burned into his mind no matter how hard he tried to get rid of it. Belatedly, Katsuki realized something else. His entrance and exit had been completely ignored. Normally, he hated it when he wasn't given the attention he deserved, but as his shaken mental faculties began to settle back down, the fact that the inhabitant of his new room had completely ignored him while not wearing a stitch of clothing began to tug on the blonde's sixth sense. This smelled like a trap. It was almost as if the staff expected him to go in there and immediately force himself on some pretty stranger girl. "What?" Bo asked, incredulity clear on his face, the blonde's words at first failing to register. "That's all you're going to point out? That's it?" The peculiar nature of these questions caused Katsuki to choke on his demands for answers. Confused now, the blonde stared at his handler in frustrated puzzlement. "No asinine screeching about being roomed with a subhuman mutant?" Bo cryptically asked, a single eyebrow raised. "No screaming about disgusting, horrifying spiders?" The flat look Katsuki returned was truly impressive. "Did you not hear me?" Katsuki growled. "The girl in my new room is naked, and I'm not going anywhere near a naked girl when you're all obviously expecting me to do something to her." Though he gave no outward sign of it, Bo was impressed with his charge. To think such a troublesome and violent child could give even an ounce of thought to the dignity of a girl who was a complete stranger to him. The shock that had stalled his mind finally passed completely, and Katsuki was fuming. The questions he'd just been asked rang in his head again, and he only felt his anger grow. He might have despised the useless green freak that had him sent to this hellhole with a burning passion, but there was one quality he'd admit they shared. They sure as hell weren't quirkists. That wasn't to say the blonde wouldn't openly admit that he loathed those weaker than him, which was pretty much most people. He would. But that was just it. Emitter, transformer, mutant. It didn't matter what quirk type an extra was. They were all equally pebbles along his path to number one. "There just might be some hope for you yet," Bo said, once more smiling calmly. Turning, the giant man knocked sharply on the wall the double-wide door had retracted into. "Kano, put some clothes on. Your new roommate's here, and he's already gotten an eyeful." A distinctly girly EP came from inside the room, followed closely by the clicking of multiple something sharp on metal and the rustling of fabric being moved around. "Give it a minute and then go on in," Bo said, smile growing into a hearty grin. "And please, try to get along. This is rehabilitation, remember, for the both of you." When the minute passed and Katsuki guardedly stepped into his new room, Bo closed the door behind the blonde with a sigh. Walking the familiar path back to the handler's workroom, the large man considered what had just happened. Unbeknownst to his charge, this setup was in no way a trap. In fact, it was actually a desperate plan to reintroduce a damaged and lost girl to positive human interaction. The poor thing had gone through the ringer recently. Her surviving parent had abandoned her. The manager she'd been signed with for years had publicly terminated their relationship, and what friends she'd had to speak of bailed as soon as they'd seen her. To make matters worse, since then hardly anyone had even tried to treat her with any human decency. After a while, when she'd shown no signs of improvement, the director of the institute had taken to arranging for randomly selected patients to come and talk to her. Unfortunately, Every attempt ended with either petrified staring or running and screaming. After giving up on finding another female patient that might have risen to the occasion, they'd moved on to the males. But the boys proved to be just as cowardly as their counterparts, or worse, quirkists. As he walked through the halls of the Institute, Bo admitted to himself that seeing his little bomber consider Junko Kano a girl first and foremost was a welcome surprise. After over 200 failures, the explosive blonde was the first not to scream bloody murder, or show even a hint of fear or disgust for that matter, after walking in on a young woman who resembled an arachne of legend. UA Courtyard, Sunset. Just within the gates of the prestigious Hero Academy, known as UA, two young figures could be seen socializing in what would appear to be pure happiness. One of these individuals, upon closer inspection, was a tall, dark-haired young woman whose beauty, still blossoming though it was, far surpassed that of many twice her age. Her companion, in contrast, was a little, blue-haired girl whose innocent smiles captivated even the coldest of hearts. Both were waiting in the courtyard for the same reason, though, to meet with a green-haired couple returning from their date. Although, truth be told, only one was looking forward to the reunion. "Momone," Lily called out, words coming out muffled as her head was buried in her caretaker's bosom. The older girl had squeezed her tightly in a lovely hug several minutes ago, and then never let go. "Are your ears really okay now?" The rather developed young woman took the solemn question in stride, although the pang she felt in her stomach at hearing the guilt in her little Lily's voice hit her hard. "Yes," Momo responded immediately with no hesitation. Noticing the look being given to her by the little one in her arms, the mature Ravenette decided perhaps being more detailed would assuage her precious Lily's fears. "I only notice anything when I wake up in the mornings now. It's kind of like listening to everything underwater until I really wake up. But otherwise, everything's fine." The frown that continued to mar Lily's cute face forced Momo stop for a second. Seeing that her reassurance had little effect, she was left with no other option. With a sigh, the mature young woman finally gave in and listened to some of the advice of her therapist. It was time she tackled one of her own scars left by the USJ assault. "Lily-chan, there's really no need for you to feel guilty about what happened," Momo said, forcing the words out over the pain the memories brought up. Frustration and disappointment in herself roiled within the Ravenette, each clamoring to strangle her psyche. "If anything, it's my fault you were forced to do what you did. And if you hadn't, I'd have had no other choice but to surrender to those villains and give in to despair." As what her caretaker said slowly processed through her mind, Lily's eyes began to sparkle. Sure, she didn't quite understand all of what Momone was saying, but the relief that the older girl wasn't mad at her for what happened was visceral. The littlest zombie had never thought her actions were wrong, per se, but she did regret they ended up hurting her new big sister. "So, Lily is forgiven then?" Lily asked, just to be sure. Smiling gently, Momo gave in to her impulses once again and tightened the heartfelt hug the two were still sharing. Yes, Lily-chan is forgiven. For an instant, Momo's world was perfect. A large portion of the weight that had been pressing down on her since the USJ attack had lightened, and she had her Lily-chan in her arms. She was utterly content. But as with all things, so too would this happiness end. And much too soon in Momo's opinion. "Izu and I." Lily's shriek of joy, accompanied by the littlest zombie quickly wrestling herself free from Momo's arms, was definitely not as welcome by the mature teen as it otherwise might have been. What? Momo's shout of distress was born and died as a stutter as she turned to witness the arrival of Izuku, Ensu through UA's front archway, a toy laden Tay dutifully following behind. "It's too early. I mean, literally, it's 2 hours early." Desperate to hold on to her Lily time for as long as possible, the Revent darted after the littlest zombie, but her attempts to grab the undead cutie were all for naught. Due to her size, the Bluinette was just too agile to get a hold of, especially when she had a goal in mind. At the very least, Momo managed to keep from falling face first onto the hard concrete ground as she raced after the zombie child. Her flailing arms did make for quite a sight, though. "Izunai. Sune," Lily shouted joyfully as she leapt at her hero with a tackle hug. "Did you have fun? Oh, did you finally kiss? You're always going to be this curious, aren't you?" Izuku asked with a wry grin, head patting the zombie girl wrapped around his stomach and waist. The green-haired teen's gentle tone and kind expression took away any bite from his words. But to answer your questions, yes and yes. But no, you're not getting any details. Lily released her hero with a pout, internally cursing at how quickly her big brother had been able to see through her scheme. Upon seeing how giddy Tsune looked, however, the Blueonette guessed their date had gone really well, so she wasn't too upset. Midoriya-kun, Suchan, Momo greeted as she approached her returned classmates. It took less than a second for the mature Ravenette's eyes to pick up on how dazed Tsuyu appeared. She also couldn't help but notice the roll of tissue paper stuck in one of the amphibious girl's nostrils. Did something happen? The genuinely concerned question startled Izuku so badly he jumped, though he quickly settled down when the frog girl at his side began to cuddle into him. We had to cut the date a little short due to an unforeseen complication, Izuku hesitantly answered. He knew there was no point in flat-out lying, but giving away too many details would just be too embarrassing. Hopefully his class president would be satisfied with only the strictly necessary information. One of the rides got a little more intense than we'd expected. Suchan ended up getting a little nosebleed, and I didn't want her to suffer through it in such a public place. Momo wondered over what the green-haired teen might have meant by intense, but judging by how happy Tsuyu looked, it couldn't have been too bad. Perhaps the Ferris wheel had gone higher than the amphibious teen had been comfortable with? Was everything all right on your end? Izuku asked, easily breaking Momo from her musings, as he'd intended. Did Lily cause you any trouble? Indignant, the zombie girl in question puffed out her cheeks and whirled on around in a huff. Aizu and Lily doesn't cause problems. Lily cried out. When the gathered teens turned to look at her, the littlest zombie had already replaced her pout with a bright smile and cute pose. Lily brings happiness. She was an angel, Momo affirmed, patting the head of her precious Lily-chan. Izuku nodded, glad that his request hadn't inconvenienced one of the few classmates he had that held no reservations about him. He was also glad that same classmate was one that Lily seemed to enjoy spending time with as well. I'm glad to hear that, Izuku replied with a smile, although for Momo, the look brought a sinking dread to her stomach. She knew what was coming. Well, it's time for us to go home. I've still got to walk Suchan to her place. Momo did her best to keep the despair she felt at her vice's announcement from showing on her face. Luckily for her, the green-haired teen had already turned away, checking to see if Tsuyu's nose had stopped bleeding. Thank you for taking care of Lily, Momone, Lily exclaimed as she turned to her big sister. The zombie girl gave an absolutely cute bow. Please play with Lily again sometime. Already? The uncharacteristic and completely unladylike shout startled the green-themed couple, forcing the distressed heiress to calm herself and elaborate as all attention was quickly focused on her. It's just that, it's sooner than I'd expected. There's still 2 hours before my ride's supposed to arrive and take me home. And I'd rather not spend that long alone, you know? A fidgeting Momo was quite the sight to behold, one Izuku completely ignored as he quickly realized the mature young woman had a point. Leaving her to wait by herself would be unacceptably rude, not to mention he wasn't heartless, and escorting the Ravenette home was out of the question as well with Tsuyu in her current state. Before the green-haired teen had a chance to answer, however, the very ground beneath them began to vibrate. Unlike the sharp ferocity of an earthquake, the rumbling was almost more akin to what one would think stampeding rhinos would cause. The shaking quickly earned the full attention of all present. Maasasa. It happened so fast Momo never had a chance at following what was going on. But for Izuku, it may as well have been going in slow motion. One moment there was nothing. The next, a massive form of bulging muscle was barreling toward them like a meteor, the UA barrier completely non-responsive. Mad eyes, the left scarred, glared out from the charging mountain, so intently focused on some unknown target that it was as if nothing else existed. Izuku knew in a split second he lacked the reflexes to do more than brace himself while nudging Tsuyu behind him. Luckily, he needn't have worried. Reacting faster than anyone had believed her condition would have allowed, Tay grabbed her master and his beloved by their collars and hauled them backward, whipping them both out of the path of the mountain-sized human barreling toward them. Lily reacted similarly, roughly pushing Momo out of harm's way in the blink of an eye. And then, the littlest zombie did nothing more to move herself to safety. Time slowed to a crawl as the giant took one last earth-shaking stomp, coming to a complete halt inches from Lily's tiny frame. Zuko, you okay? The words were slow and ponderous, and they were quiet, dry whispers that failed to carry even in the dead silence caused by the hulking new arrival. Too busy checking for injuries of any shape or form, Izuku completely missed the lowly murmured concern. The frog girl herself was doing her best to calm her poor heart. The date, while short, had been too intense for her, as unprepared as she'd been. The excitement had caused a sudden spike in her blood pressure, which had caused a profuse nosebleed, an embarrassment she hadn't suffered since she was a tadpole. And just now, a giant had almost crushed her underfoot. I'll survive, I think, Tiu said, gently placing her hands atop her worrying boyfriend's. Then it hit her. Did Taechan just talk? Not expecting that to be the first question his beautiful frog girl asked after nearly being run over, Izuku blinked in utter bafflement. Uncertain, the green-haired teen glanced from his girlfriend to his first partner. Argrego? The groan Tay uttered at the green duo was accompanied by a questioning stare from empty red eyes, causing Tiu to sigh. Of course, the frog girl mumbled to herself, realizing the distraction had allowed her heart to return to normal. What was I thinking? Karo, don't you touch her. The incredibly loud and angry demand caused Izuku and Tiu to snap their heads around to find the source, none other than an enraged Momo Yaoyorozu. In a disturbing parody of the villain from a Stranger Danger cartoon, the mountain-sized man had reached out a hand toward Lily. Momo, wondering how she'd ended up on the ground when she'd just been standing next to her little angel, had a front row seat to the scene. Instantly, her brain took her back to the USJ assault. Her body reacted on instinct, with extreme prejudice, to prevent a repeat of the failures that still haunted her. In the blink of an eye, surpassing limitations she'd always believed her quirk to have, the Ravenet had created a reinforced titanium staff. The snap creation completely destroyed the sleeve of her uniform's right arm, but by the ferocious look in her eyes, it was clear Momo could have cared less. The class president of UA's 1A wasted no time, and swung her newly formed weapon with all her might. With a striking precision, Momo slammed her staff into the side of her target's head, the force great enough to bend the metal construct as it impacted the man that rivaled the USJ Nomu in size and musculature. The unknown assailant's head turned slightly as a result of the blow, but he didn't fall. Pappy, are you all right? The utter lack of concern Lily delivered those words with immediately snapped the three human observers from their shock at seeing someone effortlessly tank Momo's attack. The almost nonchalance was incredibly out of character for the little zombie girl. Pappy? Momo asked, honestly confused. For all that her brain was normally lauded for its above-average intelligence, reconciling the childish term with the mountainous man standing in front of her Lily appeared to be beyond even its capabilities. The bent staff, coupled with only a slight bump on the man's head, did no favors for the Ravenet's mental short-circuit. Seeming to slowly come to attention, the giant man sluggishly shook his head, a massive hand coming up to rub at his new injury. Shaking himself, the stranger straightened, causing his already intimidating size to grow even larger. Huh? Oh yeah, the mountainous man replied, voice deep but unexpectedly soft. It does hurt a bit more than usual though. Belatedly, Momo came to the horrifying realization that not only did her Lily know this imposing man, but he was also her father, and she'd just viciously attacked him. Yet another mistake caused by her lack of thinking. I'm sorry. Momo rather cutely shouted her apology, childishly dropping her bent weapon as quickly as possible. The manners her parents had drilled into finally kicked in, and the Ravenet gave the newly found father of her Lily a quick, deep bow. Still nonplussed by the sudden development, Izuku took a step closer to the apparent father of one of his quirk's victims, making sure to keep himself between Tsu and the man. Matching his movements perfectly, Tay continued to shield her master zealously, a gleam in her dull red eyes. So, this is your father, Lily-chan? Izuku asked, taking another step forward. Aren't you going to introduce us? The playful question had hardly left the green-haired teen's lips before Lily jerked into motion. The littlest zombie gave a beaming smile as she hopped in between the opposing parties. To her big brother, however, the merry tune the blunette hummed did little to mask her tenseness. Pappy, This is Izu and I, Lily said, beginning introductions. He's the one who brought Lily back. He's Lily's savior and hero. Izuku tried not to blush at the praises being heaped upon him, but it was a close thing. While he had recently made the commitment to remember that there were people who didn't see him as a monster, the green-haired teen still found himself floundering in the face of honest adoration at times. Izanai, this is Lily's pappy, Lily continued, hardly taking a moment for a breath she no longer really needed to take. He's a little clueless sometimes, and can forget important things really easily, but he's not a bad person. The further along she went into her father's presentation, the easier it was to tell Lily was forcing her cheerfulness. Ever her mother's daughter, and keen to observe what went unsaid by those around her, noticed how the feeling of danger in the air had hardly been diffused. That is nice, Masao, but it is time to say goodbye, Lily's father said neutrally. The man completely disregarded everything and everyone not his daughter, as if the little brunette was the only one present. We are going home. Now. The declaration almost staggered Izuku, but he managed to catch himself before his shock caused him to stumble back. The green-haired teen would normally never be against a family reunion, especially one like this, but reality was a harsh mistress. As much as he wanted Lily to have her happy ending so soon after being risen, the fact was he'd heard the little sweetheart had gone feral when he hadn't been near. The very concept gave him pause. This strange man had no idea what he was walking into. He needed to be warned. Warned about, well, pretty much everything. Sir, before we talk about leaving, there's something you need to. No, that's not happening. Lily cutting in and interrupting Izuku was not what had the four humans present reel back in surprise. No, what caused such a stark reaction was the serious, in no way prepubescently feminine, tone the littlest zombie spoke in. It hardly sounded like the brunette at all. What? Both Izuku and Lily's father shouted, one in surprise and the other confused frustration. Even Tu and Momo stood agog, unable to contrive words to describe the unexpected development. Lily refuses to return to that house, the zombie girl elaborated, getting back into character. The people who killed Lily might still be there, until they're all brought to justice. The brunette stopped. The shaking of her shoulders instantly clued Izuku in that she was reliving the nightmare of her death once again. Without thinking, the budding necromancer stepped up and placed a steady hand on the shoulder of his quirk's second prisoner. The gesture seemed to work, as Lily's quivering frame gradually steadied. Meanwhile, the neutral expression Lily's mountainous father had maintained gave way to agitation. Killed? The man asked, opening eyes that had hitherto been closed. The small beady orbs were hazy and unfocused. Masao, what? You are not. Lily gave only a sad little sigh in response. Turning, Izuku was treated to the zombie girl's soulful red gaze pleading for his help. And like any good big brother, hero in training or not, the green-haired teen resolved himself to help. Not that he'd needed any added incentive. Sir, this isn't the best place to talk about this. Izuku started, completely forgetting his hand that was still on Lily's shoulder. A fact that the zombie girl's father, unfortunately, locked onto. I'm sure that Principal Nizu will. No. The sudden booming refusal froze Izuku like a deer in headlights. No one is taking my baby away. Enraged, the mountain-sized man reached for Lily again. Seeming to have expected the action, the littlest zombie easily sidestepped the grab and quickly darted behind the protective shield that was her big brother. Jolted by the sudden change from the father of her Lily, Momo scrambled to recover her bent weapon. She tensed, reaching forward and wrapping Lily in her arms like she had her younger siblings many times before. Tay growled, maneuvering herself further between the threat to her master and the green-haired teen. The apprehensive looks the teens were giving the large man failed to register. In fact, they failed to register. What did give the towering figure pause, however, was the look of saddened disappointment being directed at him by the smallest of the group. What? The man stilled, wild eyes blinking in startled confusion. Emisao. Lily-chan maybe. Izuku didn't know what to say, what he could suggest to make everything better. It was all falling apart, too quickly for him to keep up with. And it was his entire fault. I think he's good at protecting me, Lily reluctantly said, unwilling to make matters worse, but unable to find a better option. Better than Pappy. Lily doesn't want to go through what happened ever again. Can Pappy promise that? Even though her stepmother had been recently apprehended, knowledge Lily and Izuku had learned thanks to Detective Tsukachi, there would still be a bit of time before her court date. And the men that had used and abused her were proving to be a problem. Thanks to their money and the lawyers said money paid for, they'd eluded arrest so far. If she went home with her Pappy, Lily knew she would be an easy target for them. Her hero, her big brother Izuku, had the benefit of dating the daughter of a woman who, thanks to the internet, Lily had learned could easily destroy more than just the lives of the ones who'd killed her if angered. And as long as she stayed with her savior, she'd be under the watchful eyes of both the principal of the most prestigious hero academy in Japan as well as the QRA. Yes, she'd noticed the watchers. But it was quite obvious to Lily that the agents were deathly afraid of her big sister Taechan and big sister Momo. Lily's thoughts were interrupted as her Pappy finally acknowledged the existence of the others present, more worrisomely the only other male, and pointed a large finger at the green-haired teen. You, unfocused, beady eyes flared with hatred so intense their target couldn't even take a step back. What did you do to my baby, you monster? The living mountain made to grab a hold of Izuku by the front of his shirt. That was a mistake. Gah! Tei's grunt nearly screamed out of her mouth as she leapt at the man attacking her master. Snapping a fist out, the zombie girl nailed her target squarely in the solar plexus. Ugh! Lily's father dropped like a boulder, doubling over in pain. He wasn't used to dealing with real injuries. But for Izuku, the damage had already been done. It had happened. One of his most dreaded nightmares had come true. The parent of one of his quirk's victims had confronted him and called out his monstrous nature. If he'd thought his imaginings had been painful, the reality of it all was gut-wrenching. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world was closing in on him. He felt numb. Izuku-an. Suyu released her hold on Lily and engulfed her stricken boyfriend in the strongest hug she could manage. Pulling on years of comforting distressed younger siblings, the frog girl put everything she could into projecting all the love she had for the wonderful green-haired teen in her arms. You are not a monster. Karo. Izuku couldn't have replied even if he'd tried. His throat was tight from fighting down his sobs, and tears clouded his vision. Still, the devastated hero in training managed to hug Hugh back, drinking deeply from the love he felt radiating from his girlfriend to keep himself from breaking apart. It was to this scene Nizu arrived, concern and distress having caused him to abandon bipedal motion in favor of using all four of his limbs to scurry as quickly as possible. The principal had hoped he'd be able to make it in time, but he couldn't ignore the unfortunate fact his efforts had been in vain. I was afraid this would happen. Nizu's pained, high-pitched voice caught the attention of all present, even Lily's father. Midoriya-kun, Takeo, I think it best that we head to my office so we can sort this out. Yairza-san, I'm afraid it's time you headed home. This is a private matter. I understand, sir. Momo acquiesced, knowing better than to even attempt to sneak her way into such a situation if the principal was involved. Something still nagged at her, though, as gathered herself to leave. But, just who's Masao? 2 days later, UA cafeteria. The students of Class 1A, while most of them, had decided to gather together after their scheduled therapy sessions of the day for a very important mission. Though they sat scattered around the cavernous room at the moment, they were going to start, and hopefully finish, the assignment Aizawa-sensei had given them in one go so that they'd have the entire next week free. And seeing as how it was still only Thursday, many were positive they'd accomplish their goal. Izuku and Tsuyu, though already done with the assignment, had still thoughtfully agreed to show up for moral support. Lily is so sorry. Lily whispered once again to her big brother, despondent ruby eyes making for quite the unethical weapons of mass destruction. Izuku, still unable to look at the littlest zombie since the incident with her father, managed to give the undead child a few head pats. It's okay. The haunted answer earned a whimper from Lily. It tore at her little heart that she couldn't make her big brother smile anymore. Worse, he wouldn't even look at her. Her pappy had ruined everything. For Izuku, the day he'd met Takeo stood as a stark reminder of how the general public would see his quirk, how his evil, necromantic abilities would be perceived. It had taken hours for Nizu to force the massively sized man to understand that his precious child had died, was now undead, the principal witness to her own murder, and that he no longer had any rights to her custody until such a time that the court cases revolving around the crime had ended. And even then, should Izuku choose to relinquish custody of Lily, the QRA would immediately take her. Being the result of a dangerous, anomalous quirk gave the shady agency more than enough legal cause to trump post-mortem parental rights. "You did nothing wrong, Izuku," Hugh quickly added, knowing her boyfriend was still too close to breaking down. Gosen shouldn't have said what he did. Even Principal Nizu agreed he wasn't in his right mind at the time. Karo, after finally getting Takeo to calm down from his inconsolable raging grief, it had taken another extra hour for the man to accept the reality of what had happened. The woman he'd married had been a monster that had sold his precious baby to animals the second she'd had the opportunity. The tragedy of Lily's death was a direct result of his actions and inattention. He was, in part, to blame for what had happened. Takeo Go, however, had never apologized, even after his wailing and grieving. The man insisted on needing Lily, that he would find a way to get her back, even if it meant finding a way to truly resurrect her. Izuku would have encouraged this, but Lily's reaction had been faster. The littlest zombie had morosely reminded her father that getting absorbed in his research was what had gotten her killed in the first place, and that he was more likely to forget about her again before succeeding. Izuku and Tsuyu had been greatly surprised to find that Takeo was an accomplished scientist. The look of heated resentment in the man's eyes as he'd reluctantly left Nizu's office had badly hurt Izuku, to the point Tsuyu realized she'd have to work extra hard to ensure her boyfriend's fragile mental state didn't deteriorate further or shatter altogether. Needless to say, Izuku's mother, self-proclaimed mother-in-law, and even his therapist had made it quite clear that they all wanted nothing more than to strangle the ever-living shit out of the man. I know, Izuku replied weakly, hugging Tsuyu in a clear sign of needing support. The green-haired teen couldn't find the words to describe how much he needed the frog girl right now. She kept him going with her steady, unending love. It was a source of strength for him, keeping him from the abyss. It hurts. Izuku wasn't the only one hurting, however. Toru Hagakure stood to the side, watching as her classmates went about their lives, fighting to overcome the harshness of a reality that had struck at them when they were so utterly unprepared to face it. She was, of course, completely naked at the moment, as well as silent. She couldn't, deal with her classmates right now, especially the other girls. Mina looked so cheerful, poking and laughing with Kirishima as the two scribbled out ideas together for their papers. The pink-hued girl had been strong enough to conquer her trauma, leave it in the past, and carry on as a true heroine should. Tsuyu had Izuku to worry about, but the frog girl herself looked like she'd moved past her issues as well. Jiro still seemed completely unaffected by the ordeal they'd all gone through, face as impassive as ever. And Momo was Momo. Toru felt like such a complete failure. Even Achiko, down as she'd been the last couple of days, had been taking things better than her. At least the brunette was able to show her face to their friends. And that, as she discovered, was the root of her problems. After a disastrous first day, which she'd spent unloading everything she'd been bottling up, Toru's next meeting with her therapist had managed to reveal to the invisible girl that she had no idea how to be herself. Since her quirk had come in when she was 4, the unseen girl had lived by hiding her true self in favor of matching the expectations of those around her. That people couldn't see her facial expressions had made this all the easier. She could say whatever she wanted about how she felt, and no one could call her out. Their first day of class, she decided to match Mina's personality because she'd loved how carefree and strong the pink girl had appeared to be. The imitations had the unintended side effect of making the acid user instantly bond with her, something Toru had been beyond grateful for after years of being easily forgotten by the girls of her elementary and middle schools. And then the assault on the USJ had happened, and the invisible teen had had her ideality shattered. Mina was human, impulsive and flawed. Kirishima wasn't as unbreakable as she'd envisioned. Even Ojiro hadn't turned out to be the level-headed fighter she'd thought him to be. Toru knew that she was less than any of them, but if her very understanding of who her classmates were had been so wrong, then how could she emulate them? How could she match up and stand with them? And she desperately wanted to stay with the others of 1A. They were her friends, and she couldn't imagine living in a world without them anymore. The realization that she'd been so wrong in her impersonations paled, however, to the horror Toru had experienced when her mind had caught up to what she'd done in the heat of the moment at the USJ. Her body had reacted, and she'd been left to come to terms with her actions after they'd been done. Yes, she'd rescued her friends, but was she really savage enough to do what she'd done? What part of Toru Hagakure had been at work when she'd snapped that villain's arms like twigs? Just who was Toru Hagakure really? It was this concern, this unanswered question that made the invisible teen grimly resolve to avoid mingling with the rest of her class. She didn't feel like she was a part of it anymore. Toru didn't know if, given the chance, she would act heroically and stand with the others, cowardly, and flee in fear, or savage, and reveal that terrifyingly aggressive part of herself again. Hagakure-san, the calm, measured voice of Mizo Shuji, one of A's gentle giants, startled Toru from her spiraling introspection to the point that she was unable to even yelp in surprise at being found out. Are you feeling well? A moment of silence passed, and Toru glanced over herself to make sure she was in fact wearing absolutely nothing. She was, indeed, still naked. It was then that she saw that Shuji's voice had come from an extended tentacle, one that was unobtrusively pointing her way. The extension of the large teen's quirk had grown an ear and a mouth, as well as two odd holes over the toothy orifice. Can you really see me? Toru asked, breath catching in her throat. Slowly, the invisible girl shyly reached up to cover her breasts and groin with her hands, feeling exposed for the first time in her entire life. I can, but not in the way you are probably thinking, Mizo replied, the tentacle twisting slightly at the end in an odd parody of a head tilting to the side. I was testing one of the theories that Midoriya-kun had postulated about my quirk. When it actually worked, I came to notice your presence. That you hadn't revealed yourself so far led me to believe something was concerning you, though I apologize if I am incorrect. Toru blinked, utterly surprised. Although, perhaps she shouldn't have been, this was beginning to become a common occurrence after all. Every now and then, Midoriya would approach a member of 1A and start up a friendly conversation, one usually geared towards the member's quirk. A day or two later, the green-haired teen would present a few pages of quirk theories, ideas, and even plans for the student in question to use. Toru had to admit, she was actually still waiting for Midoriya to come talk to her, but with the attack on the USJ, she understood why he hadn't gotten around to it yet. How? Toru asked, voice weak and shaking. Her reaction could be seen as justified. Her entire life, she'd believed she'd never be seen again, and in a handful of days a classmate had devised a way for another classmate to, in some way, perceive her. The tone his normally gregarious classmate had just used caused the normally stoic giant to frown in puzzlement. Not that anyone sitting around him would have been able to tell with his mask in place. According to Midoriya-kun, some serpents retain a pit organ that enables a form of thermal vision. Mizo's answer only left the invisible girl more confused. As it turns out, dupliarms can replicate the organs of animals as well as long as I have an in-depth understanding of what I'm trying to form. Thankfully, Midoriya-kun was gracious enough to include leads for me to follow if I chose to research on my own. I see. Toru was speechless. For the first time since she was 4, someone could actually see her. Looking over at the silver-haired giant sitting across from Tokoyami, she felt her heart skip a beat as she realized Shuji was looking directly at her, the two locking eyes. Hagakure-san, do you wish to talk? Mizo's worry came through clearly from the tentacle's mouth. The oftentimes silent teen was well aware that his invisible classmate had been avoiding everyone these past few days, a change from the girl's normally extroverted personality, too extreme for him to just ignore. I would be more than happy to listen if you need someone to lend an ear. Or 3. The tentacle before her grew 2 more ears in response, and Toru couldn't help the giggle that escaped her. As she fought to contain her laughter, the invisible teen felt a lightness in her chest that she'd never noticed until now she'd never felt before. Her silver-haired classmate's words struck her deeply, and it only took a glance at Mina and Kirishima for her to admit that maybe confiding in someone besides her therapist would be good for her. Straightening herself, Toru gave a resolute nod to the multi-armed, gentle giant of 1A. In their own little world, Mina Ashido and Eijiro Kirishima continued to trade light-hearted jokes, jabs to the ribs, and most importantly, laughter. The two longtime friends were glad their classmates had agreed to this little get-together. Finishing their papers now meant they'd have a whole week to hang out and train. There'd definitely be training, of course. Hey, Kiri, don't look, but I think Shuji is talking to Toru, Mina whispered, leaning over slightly to deliver her message directly into her red-headed friend's ear. I hope he's offering to help her out. I'm worried about her. The boy on the receiving end of Mina's whispering tensed, fighting both the knee-jerk reaction to immediately look where he'd just been told not to, as well as the tingling that rushed from his ear to his chest at his friend's action. Without looking away from the notepad he'd been using to play a game of doodle war against Mina, Kirishima threw in his own 2 yen. Shuji's pretty manly, the redhead said lowly, following Mina's lead to keep this between themselves. I bet he can get her to open up. Don't worry. The acid user beamed at the answer, turning her attention back to the game at hand. With a few scribbles, she stopped Kirishima's Spinosaurus from crushing her hedgehog by doodling a portal into existence that moved the dinosaur's foot to stomp its own head. Immediately, the pink-hued teen wished she hadn't, as the sight of a portal, even drawn, sent memories of the USJ attack flooding through her thoughts. The smile slipped from her face, and Mina sighed. Already attuned to the way Mina could suddenly slip from one mood to another, something that had only been happening since they'd survived the assault on their class, Kirishima quickly reached under the table and grabbed the pink hand that had fallen there at his friend's abrupt despondence. There were a lot of things he'd promised himself after they'd made it out that day, but the one oath the redhead took more seriously than any other was the one where he'd proclaimed to Mina that he'd help her work through her trauma from the USJ, no matter how long or what form it took. You know, I still blame myself, Mina said hollowly, abandoning the doodle war in favor of staring a hole into the table. If I hadn't been so impulsive, maybe Toru and I wouldn't have stuck around in the ruins zone. You guys could have taken care of yourselves no problem, but I should have focused more on getting us to safety. Mina, hold on. If I remember right, you were trying to get the two of you out of there, Kirishima interrupted, squeezing the pink-hued girl's hand gently. Didn't you come through the ceiling because it was faster than the stairs? The smallest of smiles curled on one side of Mina's lips at the memory and the understanding of what her friend was trying to do. As her therapist had told her, rationally her mind knew what she'd done had been the right call, but at the same time her subconscious had problems reconciling that with what had ended up happening near the end. It looked for a target to blame, someone to shoulder the burden of what had almost happened to her and Toru, and in the absence of a logical scapegoat, it turned against itself. The result was a vicious, cyclical line of thinking that ignored her good intentions at the time and only focused on the negative consequences. Mina was once again thankful that she had a friend like Kiri to drag her out of her funks. She honestly didn't know if she would have been strong enough to handle them on her own at the beginning. If anyone's to blame for what happened, it's me, Kirishima continued, his voice drooping, snapping Mina completely from her mood. If I hadn't pissed off that Kurojari guy by going after him, he might not be sent everyone all over the place with his queer. OW. Mina frowned firmly in place, wasn't about to let her red-headed friend even entertain the idea he was at fault in any way. The sharp fingers she dug into his ribs had been enough to knock him off of it this time. But over the last couple of days she'd had to go as far as smack the back of his head, initiate a sudden trust fall into him, and even jump on his back to get him to stop blaming himself. It was kind of funny, in a way. The two of them kept the other from wallowing even as they blamed themselves the next instant. And if I remember correctly, Mina huffed, squeezing Kiri's hand back as she locked eyes with him. You only jumped in after Ojiro. You aren't at fault for his actions. So don't think you're getting to blame yourself for anything else either, Buster. After a moment, Kirishima gave the pink girl gazing into his soul a shark-toothed smile. What would he ever do without Mina Ashido? Breaking their contest of wills, the two close friends turned back to the papers spread out in front of them, content to return to the work they actually should have been doing. If anyone around them had cared to look at the two, the observer would have noticed that under the table, both had forgotten to unclasp their hands. Hands that now had fingers firmly intertwined. Away in a corner of the cafeteria, a certain Momo Yaoyorozu was suffering her own woes. Ah, and her friend Kyukijiro was doing nothing to soothe them. In fact, the punk rock girl was doing the opposite, laughing loudly while smacking their table like there was no tomorrow. As uncharacteristic as this was for the musical teen, she did have her reasons. Momo had just recently learned that her Lily, the adorably cute little girl that had stolen the hearts of many in 1A, had been born Masao ago, an adorably cute little boy. Of course, that hadn't affected the mature young woman in the slightest. In her mind, Lily choosing to live as a girl meant that nothing had really changed. But then she told her friend and 1A's resident musician, Jiro-kun. Momo bemoaned. Myth that she was being openly ridiculed came at the hands of one of her friends, even if it was good-naturedly. This is no laughing matter. Even being referred to with Kuin did nothing to quell the punk rock girl's mirth. Kyone is laughing at Lily? The sudden question posed by the littlest zombie, who'd until just then been sitting glumly by Izuku and Tsu, did bring the musician to a halt though. Lily is still Lily. Once she'd realized her big brother wouldn't smile for her, the undead child had decided that for now he'd be better off with the attention of Tsu-chan and big sister Tae. Lily hadn't taken long to find where her other big sister had gone, and had eagerly skipped over to a place where she knew she could bring happiness. But big sister Momo's friend had already been laughing when Lily had arrived, and from what she'd caught at the tail end of their conversation, she was the reason why. The sadness radiating from the little zombie girl erased every bit of the smile off of Jiro's face and choked her laughter. The punk rock girl instantly looked distressed at the idea of causing more grief for the already distraught undead child. And no, not at all. Hyuka quickly assured, trying to diffuse the situation her merriment had unintentionally caused. I know you're still Lily, and always have been, and I would never love you any less, regardless of what kind of body you were born into. Then, Momo's single word, drawn-out question carried with it every bit of upper-class upbringing the mature young woman could cram into it. It's just that, Hyuka explained, her shoulders already shuddering as just thinking about the cause of her laughter brought it back. I can't believe you never noticed. Unable to contain herself further, Hyuka began to laugh again. Luckily for the embarrassed Ravenette across from her, though, she was able to keep the chuckles at a lower volume this time. What? Momo barely kept her exclamation to a hiss scream. You knew? Well, managing to get a hold of herself, but only just, Hyuka elaborated. Didn't you ever see Lily get a little uncomfortable when pressed against big breasts? Or how she doesn't accept invitations to go into the restrooms or showers with other girls? And maybe it's just me, but there's a distinctive vibrato hidden in her voice. The blank stare of 1A's well-developed president caused the musician to trail off. Sometimes she forgot others couldn't pick out the subtle changes in sounds that were a normal part of life for her. And, Hyuka added, leaning forward to add suspense to her last clue as she got within whispering distance from the Ravenette. Didn't you find it suspicious that Lily only accepted changing clothes when she could be in the same room as Izuku-kun? That earned a facepalm from the mature young woman across from her, and an adorable pout from the little zombie girl. A little further away from the again laughing and pouting pair sat gathered another group of 1A members, less stellar ones. Hey, has anyone seen Ida-san or Uraraka-san? Kaminari asked, looking around for the strict teen and bubbly brunette. The absence of their stern classmate's chopping arm had finally registered with the lackluster blonde. Man, do you think they're out on a date? Siro suddenly threw out, earning attention from those at the table. We're going to run out of girls to chase at this rate. Mineta shifted in his chair, suffering through an inhuman effort not to succumb to his nature. He had a meeting with the school board at the end of the week, and he really needed to stay out of trouble until then. He'd been warned that any, even the smallest, complaints against him would see him expelled so fast he might just travel through time. To make matters worse, even if he didn't get expelled, the diminutive teen would still be facing a restriction order. He'd no longer be able to approach any girls inside the school outside of interactions necessary for classes. And even then he'd have to be on his best behavior. But the midget wasn't the only one bothered by the conversation. Would you cease your incessant need to spread baseless rumors? Fumikage growled as he paused by the table, having just been heading over to see what could make Hyuka laugh so beautifully. The avian teen was tired of people starting up toxic rumors just for the fun of it. He had countless memories of good, earnest classmates having their school lives destroyed by such practices. His own lack of a social life stood out as one such victim as well. Be there a speck of truth in what you say or not? You've no justification to meddle in the private business of our peers. Ciro and Kaminari stared at their raven-headed classmate for a moment in absolute silence, obviously startled by the theatrical outburst. Then Ciro grinned. "Geez, man, calm down." The sharp-featured teen drawled playfully. The tape user was pretty certain his fun wasn't harming anyone, and the avian teen needed to loosen up. Don't be salty just because guy talk turned to love lives. Lacking a filter but eager to join in the ribbing of one of their more stoic classmates, Kaminari whipped up a follow-up comment and let it fly, unfortunately unable to properly articulate his idea. "Yeah," Kaminari added. "It's not like you won't be able to find someone who likes birds enough to give you a chance." Ciro and Mineta immediately broke into raucous laughter. Concurrently, the remaining members of 1A stared with looks of horror at the crass choice of words that had been delivered loudly enough for all of them to hear. "Oh man," Mineta cried in delight, having fun and knowing for once he wouldn't be the target of the ensuing wrath. Such a good burn. Kaminari instantly turned pale as he fully realized what he'd just done, what he'd just said. I'm sorry, man." Kaminari fumbled, not having intended to sound like a quirkist. He hadn't wanted to actually hurt his raven-headed classmate with his words. "I didn't mean." Fumi-kun. The melodic voice calling to him from behind was probably one of two things that stopped a trembling Fumikage from acting rashly. Hyuka gently placing one of her instrument-calloused hands on his shoulder was the other. The emotional teen didn't even register the endearing nickname. The punk rock girl had stood up instantly when Kaminari had thrown his unintentional, because the blonde was too stupid to have meant it, insult. In the lingering silence, she'd walked up to Fumikage without anyone consciously noticing. The moment she knew she gained his attention, Hyuka spun the raven-headed teen around and pulled him by the lapels into a kiss. "Thanks for the date," Hyuka said breathily after breaking the kiss. "We should do it again soon." Fumikage could only nod dumbly like an idiot bewitched as he stared into the deep, dark violet eyes that were delving into his soul. Glad that his feathers hid most of his blushing, the avian teen couldn't deny he'd enjoyed that far more than the punch to the arm he'd received at the end of their first date. Still in her seat, Momo couldn't help but take in the scene with curious eyes, sharply contrasting the way she was shielding Lily's eyes with her hands. At their own table, both Izuku and Tsu gave the gothic rock duo thumbs up and wide smiles. Both green-haired teens believed their two classmates looked good together. Recovery Girl's nurse's office, some time later. In the darkened domain of the backbone of UA, two figures stared each other down, the exchange both ridiculous and terrifying at the same time. This was probably due to the fact that one of the combatants was an extremely short, elderly woman while the other was a mountain of a man with muscles reminiscent of the one and only All Might. "Long time no see, sensei," rumbled the deep voice of the man, filling the office with little effort. The words struck the old pro-heroine harder than she thought they should have. "Sensei?" Recovery Girl asked, confused because while she knew the man before her, it was only because she'd spent days looking for him in the national database. Standing feet away from the youthful heroine was none other than the elusive Nanoman. The same Nanoman who could control nanomachines, the same man who'd fooled the system at a time when its regulations were rarely revised and violations were punished with expulsions. "Sensei, did you truly forget me?" The massive man asked, hurt clear in his voice. "Your all-time favorite student? You? Really?" The elderly heroine was starting to feel a migraine coming on. Some small, drifting part of herself told her the man was speaking the truth, but for the life of her, she couldn't remember the giant ever being one of her students. Nanoman's file had revealed that the hero had lent more towards support than combat. Even so, he'd managed to rack up over a dozen successful apprehensions using his nanomachines to fortify his body. It was only due to an anonymous call revealing the generally liked hero was in reality quirkless that his career was forcibly ended. Lying to the system like that back in the day had always ensured a harsh response, regardless of heroic adequacy. "Sensei." The man looked lost and sad, before he seemed to faintly smile, as if remembering something. "Have you also forgotten how many times your cane tried to teach me not to be a crybaby?" Chiyo Shizenji started violently as her brain experienced a muddled thought flashing through it. There had once been a boy, too sentimental and emotional for his own good. A brat unlike his peers who'd challenged her intelligence more than once. She'd called him T-Takuin. The name was uttered in a potent mix of caution, surprise, and fear. Recovery Girl was suddenly unsure of herself. She just couldn't connect the name of the brat from ages past to the massive man in front of her. Nano Man, upon his forceful retirement, had foregone the continued use of his hero name. But he hadn't forsaken his brilliance. He'd returned to the path of science, tested the waters of marriage, and then tried his hand at fatherhood, all as the ever-emotional Takeo go. "It's me, Sensei," Takeo acknowledged, a large smile spreading across his face. Unfortunately, it quickly turned into a serious frown. "I know the health and safety of your students is sacred to you, Sensei, but I need your help. I need to understand the quirk of a first year here at UA." His old friend Nizu might have gotten him to allow his baby to remain under the care of that young necromancer, but Takeo had long abandoned the understanding of the word defeat. He'd made an oath as he'd left UA 2 days ago. He would find a way to undo Izuku Midoriya's quirk. And when he'd succeeded, and nothing stood between them, he'd bring his Masao back to the realm of the living for real, so that his baby could be at his side once again. A sinister guidance. Shoyuta Aizawa, pro-hero codename Eraserhead, once again shook his head at the farce that was his administrative leave, careful not to jostle the binoculars he was looking through. The need for him to work out Izu Midoriya's blood away from impressionable students he could understand, but Nizu going so far as to force him to take a small vacation? It was frustrating for the teacher, who already felt he'd returned to his optimal physical condition. And to add to the principal's unnecessary restrictions, the agency he'd normally work through had been anonymously tipped off that he'd recently suffered a grievous injury, irrespective of his current health. The pencil pushers had immediately forbidden him from partaking in his usual underground work, citing all near-fatal injuries required at minimum a month's time off the roster before heroes could be active again. Aizawa hated to admit it, he really did, but he supposed it was the logical choice. There was no way to be absolutely sure how effective Midoriya's quirk was on the living, besides himself, with only one classmate and his teacher as test subjects. While the Azui girl's wounds had also been life-threatening, she'd only had one major injury at the time of her healing, while he'd suffered much greater, widespread punishment. There could still be some undetected danger lurking about just waiting for him to push his body too far. In the long run, it was always better to play it safe when a quirk was largely unknown. However, that didn't mean he couldn't perform standard patrols and commence with regular profile researching. And that was exactly why the gruff underground hero found himself squatting on the rooftop of a particular building for the 3rd day in a row, surveying another particular building 1 block over. Running through the same streets, day after day after day, jumping from rooftop to rooftop in an obvious circuit might have seemed boring to the everyday citizen, but Aizawa had his reasons. During the day, it made for quite the moderate exercise, and since exactly what caused Midoriya's blood to burn out quickly in a host was still a vague idea at best, physical exertion seemed as good a place to start as any. By sunset, when the last shards of the sun's rays were slipping away, the rooftop of the particular building he'd always stop on created the perfect spot for reconnaissance training. There were plenty of witnesses who could attest to seeing him using his binoculars to count the number of chairs in the offices across the way. He'd even made a show of marking empty boxes on a clipboard. If anyone asked, it was physical therapy, and he was reporting it as such. No one would think to fault him for wanting to push his recovering body, especially his eyes, given who he was. Heroes were well known for their general disregard for proper recovery practices anyway, and he'd make use of that stereotype while he could. The frighteningly sadistic smile twisting Aizawa's scruff grew slightly wider. "Today this ends." The words were muttered lowly, maroon eyes glowing with barely contained malice. The bags that had hung from those eyes for so long had since cleared away. The prominent scars, old and new, that had littered the body below them were now barely noticeable. Indeed, that same body felt healthier and more energetic than it had in years. Just as ordered, Eraserhead craved revenge, itched to completely destroy the bastards he was hunting. He'd failed so miserably back then, he'd come to realize that the only flicker of redemption left to him laid in bringing justice to the little girl who'd suffered so much. And right after talking with Midnight, nothing had sounded sweeter to the underground hero than spilling the blood of every child predator he could find, to wrap them in his capture tool and squeeze until their innards spilled from their corrupt flesh, to burn his righteous fury so thoroughly into their minds they'd never have the balls to even think of children again. But then his savior, his own student, had caught wind of his intentions. He'd only lasted until Monday afternoon before Izuku Midoriya had approached him, asking after his health. The green-haired teen had been stubborn, continuously asking if there were any tasks he could assist in. Perhaps he'd stood a bit stiffly, his burden weighing on his shoulders, or maybe his usually impassive face had betrayed him, his burning need to pay for his sins too great to cover. But whatever it had been, the young hero in training had noticed. "You can tell me what's troubling you, sensei. Please." Izuku Midoriya's words had been innocent, surely, merely a plea to be allowed to assist his teacher. But they had also been the most unavoidable, if open-ended, of orders possible to the blood that flowed through Aizawa's veins. In an instant, the underground hero had found himself opening up to his green-haired student as if the boy had been his greatest friend and confidant. The sudden confession of his pains and his plans had left the normally stoic teacher trembling, although feeling somewhat oddly liberated. "Sensei, I understand how you feel to have failed to save someone, but please, don't do anything that would put you in danger. As a hero, or our teacher, we need you." The instant Izuku had issued his plea, and another unintentional, perhaps, order, all of Aizawa's plans to enact fiery, bloody vengeance turned to dust. The burning desire that had been searing his soul to end the lives of the monstrous bastards who could prey on the young and weak had been quenched. In its place, a cold, calculating rage had been born. Aizawa had immediately begun to build a new plan, one he later conceded, to himself, would ultimately be much sweeter than just slaughtering his targets. He'd still bring about long overdue justice and destroy more than a few lives, but he wouldn't disobey. "The stage is set," Eraserhead murmured, using his binoculars to peer into a particular, large office with a bay of windows that encompassed a whole wall. With his view, the underground hero easily saw the well-known reporter and her cameraman as they hurried to conceal themselves in one of the office's many closets. And the audience is in their seats. Now for the actors to arrive. On Tuesday, Aizawa had approached Detective Tsukauchi. After painstakingly holding a polite conversation for a handful of minutes, he'd managed to insinuate that looking through Lily's case file himself would be beneficial to the efforts to arrest the degenerates who'd killed her, citing his previous experiences as an underground hero. Whether the detective had believed him or not, or merely felt pressure due to his own failures involving the case, the man had loudly declared he'd be taking a break to visit an important informant the force contracted. Then, he'd simply left. The underground hero still didn't understand why the other officers present had laughed at the detective's declaration, and he didn't particularly care to. He'd gotten free access to Lily's documents for 6 hours because of it, and by the time Tsukauchi had returned, he'd gathered all the information he'd needed. "Is this how it is for you?" Eraserhead had asked quietly as he'd remembered how he devoured the files, his tone a strange mix of wonder and fear. Only those in the know would have understood to whom he spoke to, but he was a cautious man by nature. "Those perfect grades. Studying? Those are just a joke to you, aren't they?" Aizawa would never be a man that tooted his own horn, but he had a solid idea of how intelligent he was compared to others. And he would have no problems admitting that the findings he uncovered from Lily's files were in no way a result of his own analytical prowess or tactical reasoning alone. During those 6 hours he'd spent hunched over those papers, he'd managed to connect dots and identify weak points that he knew would have normally escaped him. The bastards everyone had been chasing so fervently weren't as estranged as they'd always claimed to be. How had no one ever noticed they all had meetings or reunions organized on matching dates? These gatherings had had no consistent meeting place, sure, if a location was even noted at all, but there had been other evidence. Tickets and receipts from the same businesses popped up in every target's financial records like clockwork: catering services, laundry services, public baths. The list went on, but the most helpful piece of knowledge Aizawa had gained was that the bastards all shared the same preference when it came to rental offices. Eraserhead had known he never would have been able to make these correlations before Tsukachi under normal circumstances, especially in only 6 hours. And he hadn't, Izuka had. The underground hero had experienced an epiphany while processing the dossiers, allowing Izuku's blood to solve their riddles like puzzles meant for toddlers. This level of intelligence was intoxicating as hell. Just remembering the feeling of such sharp cognizance caused Aizawa to shiver. The underground hero told himself it was only a result of thinking about the resolution he was about to see that day. Suddenly, the double doors to the large office burst open and a group of quivering children were led inside by armed grunts. As the young and crying pressed themselves against one of the walls as far from the doors as possible, men in business suits began to enter, wicked smiles already on the faces of many. Far below, and as unassumingly as possible, an unmarked anti-riot truck turned the corner onto the block. Based on its trajectory, its target was the very office building Aizawa was glaring into. And the actors have taken the stage, Eraserhead growled, eyes flicking from the bawling children to the goons, the businessmen, the truck, and back again. Still flush with Izuka's blood, it had only taken until Wednesday night for Aizawa to succeed in tricking every bastard in the dossiers that another of their number had organized one of their special parties, a celebration of once again eluding the law without difficulty. Along the way, the underground hero had even managed to uncover the network of child traffickers the bastards employed. With Izuku's orders as they were, his knee-jerk reaction to take the scum out immediately was crushed, and he'd let the criminals continue their sins for the time being. Faking a request for fresh prey had turned Aizawa's stomach, but it meant that this group of children wouldn't have been exposed to the same treatment that Lily had suffered. And additionally, they'd each become a witness, a nail in the coffins of the bastards who'd taken them from their homes and families for their own sick pleasures. The reporter had been an afterthought, honestly. Call it his vindictive side showing. It had been disheartening to again experience how easily any information from, by, or about a hero could catch the ear of the press. To be fair, learning that a group of society's rich and powerful was going to throw one of their exclusive parties at a secret venue would have been too good to pass up regardless of source though. The likelihood of illicit practices occurring, from corporate espionage to market manipulation, would draw in any servant of the media worth their salt. These topics always ignited scandals and brought in ratings after all. Aizawa had selected the reporter currently hiding in a closet and no doubt on the verge of having a heart attack, due in large part because she was one of the only ones he knew by name that proudly held a reputation for honesty and fierce protection of the truth. He hoped she enjoyed covering the story of her life tonight. The strong police movement, that was all Tsukachi's doing. An anonymous caller had left a message for the detective citing insider knowledge that the bastards he'd been failing to catch had recently booked a large office for a meeting, in a building belonging to a hitherto unknown mutual acquaintance of all involved. When the caller had listed a date and time, the detective had about fallen out of his chair. And when Aizawa had quietly reported the presence of a number of kidnapped children from the area, he had. Now there was only one box left for the underground hero to check. It's about time. Eraserhead paused, lowering his binoculars so he could truthfully say he'd only seen the businessmen entering their rented office if anyone asked. For my alibi to arrive. Due to Izuku's orders clearing his head, Aizawa had realized he'd need to be as disassociated from the coming operation as possible. There had to be no chance for the bastards' lawyers to cry foul, because a hero with a grudge had gotten involved. He'd seen too many cases of such happening in his rookie years. The sound of footsteps behind him told the underground hero that everything was going according to plan. As soon as Midnight finished her dramatic approach, she'd watch over him as he did a bit more physical therapy, and no one would have any reason to suspect he'd had any part in bringing down the bastards about to be caught. Oh, well, if it isn't Eraserhead, called a warm, bubbly feminine voice. Aizawa's focus on following his plan instantly dissolved as he felt his body involuntarily tense. He knew that voice, and the woman it belonged to. What a coincidence. The underground hero followed his knee-jerk reaction and twisted around. Long, seafoam green locks topped by an orange bandana caught his widened eyes first. Following a familiar path, his gaze dropped, taking in a playfully mischievous smile before darting up to catch on the twin dark emeralds that were already staring back at him. Those eyes. Aizawa felt a twinge in his chest, which he dutifully ignored. Why was she here? Where was Midnight? What the joke? Eraserhead nearly sputtered before managing to regain control of himself. What are you doing here? The ever-smiling heroine quirked a brow at the out-of-character reaction, but quietly shook off the feeling that had been sinking her stomach all morning as she took in the sight of the man before her. Whatcha mean, Eraser? I just felt like patrolling the area today, Miss Joke eventually replied, flashing her trademark childish smile. Noticing the deadpan expression glaring back at her, the pro-heroine let out a huff while making a show of rolling her eyes. Fine. I was going about my merry way when Midnight hit me up out of the blue. She said you needed some company Shoyuta. Needing company. A coded phrase used in Japan's hero profession to alert other pro-heroes that one of their own was in danger of losing their cool, falling to their grief, or generally giving the vibe of being a hair's breadth from going on a bloody revenge crusade. This wouldn't be the first time Aizawa had been declared in need of company, but having the woman in front of him, of all people, say so caused another twinge to spike through his chest. Damn Midnight and her meddling. That is not the case. Aizawa did his best to drawl in his most unaffected tone. The gruff underground hero took a few steps away from his previous perch, slouching into a nearby chair that some thoughtless employee had left on the rooftop who knew how long ago. Hopefully his unexpected guest wouldn't notice the trash can full of juice pouches behind him, or it'd be obvious he'd spent more time at this spot than would be considered normal. Oh really? Ms. Joke asked, her grin only widening as she leaned forward, fists planted on her stripped shorts-clad hips. To any casual observer, it would have appeared as if the seafoam-haired woman were attempting to catch her gruff companion's attention by invading his personal space. But those who knew the two would know she was really trying to get a better read on the man. Gonna gimme that old lone wolf bullshit again? No. Eraserhead answered as neutrally as possible. The flat response caused Ms. Joke to throw a questioning look his way. The man before her didn't seem unhinged or on the brink. What had caused Midnight so much worry? I haven't been cleared yet. At most I'm allowed to exercise to see if I can handle hero work again. For the first time since her arrival onto the rooftop, Emi Fukakato felt her ever-present smile slip. For as long as she'd known Shoyuta Aizawa, he'd never been one to let the scrapes and scraps of the job affect him. If he was willingly taking a step back, then, so it's true, Ms. Joke asked, palpable concern weighing down her words. The seafoam greenette had to restrain herself from reacting further, like she wanted to. The reports just said 2 UA staff had been injured protecting their students. One of them was you, wasn't it? Injured would have been putting it mildly, but Aizawa had no intention of adding to the worry he could see radiating from Ms. Joke's face. I got better, Eraserhead said plainly, the poor attempt at humor doing nothing to chase away the look being directed at him. One of my students healed me up on site. Nizu's just being a pain and forcing me to take some vacation time. I'm fine. Ms. Joke stared at the underground hero for a long moment, intently taking in his features. She didn't fail to notice that, quite strangely for a man who'd recently been wounded in battle, Eraserhead actually looked better than ever. His skin was a healthier shade. His posture indicated vitality for once instead of the perpetual exhaustion it usually did. And were there less scars on his face? Must be quite the white mage, that one. Ms. Joke murmured before giving an appreciative whistle, enjoying the changes she could see. So what do you say? Want to do a run like the old days? Why would I? Eraserhead's habitual attempt to rebuke the offer was interrupted as his stomach let out a loud, rumbling growl. It was at that moment that Aizawa remembered that he hadn't eaten anything that day besides a juice pack that morning. Ms. Joke's sweat dropped as the underground hero fought down the slight flush threatening his cheeks. Because I'll treat you to some ramen? Ms. Joke stated more than asked, breaking the awkward silence. While her tone held nothing but seriousness, the seafoam-haired heroine's guileful smile had returned full force. Realizing that he had no rational excuse for resisting further, and he really did need to be out of the area soon anyway, Aizawa grumbled as he swallowed his displeasure and heaved himself out of his chair. He could do this. He could spend one evening with her again, and this is not a date. As Eraserhead started heading off towards a well-known ramen stand, he was unable to ignore Ms. Joke's chortling beside him. Some things never changed, and others did. Like the luck of the bastards, he was now leaving to their fate. Everything had gone according to plan, sans the seafoam-haired heroine now running beside him. And as this particular Friday came to an end, so too would his crusade. Vengeance for Lily, for all of the victims of those monsters would be had. And if that vengeance was so cold and brutal it was almost villainous, then so be it. Saturday morning, Mizudafu Police HQ. Together and roughly in a V formation, Izuku, Tae, and Lily stepped inside the imposing structure that was the police headquarters. The trio were dressed in their hero costumes, Lily's just recently having been finished, although that caused more of a scene than not due to the fact that the littlest zombie's uniform was a pink copy of Tae's. It went against every rule of stealth and had no practical utility, but since the Bluinette's role was to be support anyway, Izuku had raised no objections when he'd been asked for his permission. Midoriya-san, Detective Tsukachi greeted the green-haired teen as soon as the trio finished crossing the enormous lobby of the building. The slightly ruffled appearance of the usually tidy man made it clear he was, or had recently been, in a hurry. I apologize for asking you to ditch your free weekend, but we could really use your help at this time. Not for the first time, Izuku was glad he's requested his sunglasses be given a special treatment so that they acted like two-way mirrors when out of sunlight. With their size, the green-haired teen felt as if half his face was covered, and the extra concealment, real or imagined, helped the hero in training bury how nervous he felt in stressful situations. Situations like this, when he'd been called unceremoniously to the police headquarters. "It's all right, detective," Izuku quickly assured, bowing to the older man. Lily, who'd been silently pouting at being ignored, swiftly copied her Enai-san's respectful posture. "As you said, I had the weekend free, and I'd rather spend that time working than thinking." The Verdunette spoke the truth. Friday night had been full of distress for him. When they discovered they'd have to be apart, Tiu had nearly been inconsolable. The froggy teen had planned to spend her entire weekend ensuring her boyfriend stayed above the abyss of depression that seemed to trail him even after all of his therapy sessions. But her younger siblings had been scheduled dentist appointments for Saturday and then physical checkup Sunday, due to their family's quirks oftentimes affecting their physiology. In a way, Izuku felt relieved that Tsukachi had such little compunction with requesting aid from a boy with such cursed blood, even if it was only to solve a case that needed immediate resolution. Needless to say, the green-haired teen was glad to have something to keep his mind occupied. It was nice to be able to look at Lily again and be able to smile. "I see." It pained Tsukachi to see someone so young and kind suffer so harshly for all the wrong reasons. Unfortunately, there was work to do and justice to be had. He could offer the Verdunette advice later. "Please, if you would, follow me." With his extracurricular internship with the police force officially beginning the upcoming Monday and only lasting until that week's Friday, Izuku had naturally assumed there'd be a measured pace to his lessons. Surely an institution like the police force would have streamlined their orientation and training programs by now. First, he'd probably start out learning about all of the paperwork and protocols that went into upholding the laws of the land. After 2 days of that, then he'd probably be shown the ins and outs of how to process crime scenes and the protocols involved with them for another 2 days. Finally, on his last day, he'd probably be given case files to check and learn about all the common mistakes heroes accidentally committed when filing their reports. However, due to the fact that he was being called in early, Izuku wasn't as surprised as he otherwise would have been when he discovered the detective was guiding him to the morgue. "Midoriya-san." Tsukachi's voice pulled Izuku from his racing thoughts, the detective sounding far more serious than he'd ever heard him before. "I know you were probably expecting something more along the lines of desk work and protocols, but the department has stumbled upon a rather important case, and we've hit a wall." "Arga." Tae's sudden annoyed-sounding groan interrupted the detective before he could finish his explanation. The Verdunette and Bluinette turned, but the older zombie girl was her usual empty-eyed self. The two seemed to have understood whatever message there'd been in the wordless noise regardless, although the detective could only blink in confusion. "Yeah, I figured as much as well," Izuku finally said, receiving a pat on the back from his first partner. "Why else would I be here of all places, if not to use my quirk?" While he tried to make the words lighthearted, the pained smile the green-haired teen failed to hide made Tsukachi wince. The detective hated that it seemed like they only wanted Izuku for his quirk. This won't cause trouble for Aizu and I, will it? Lily asked, bringing a nervous smile to Tsukachi's lips. He still wasn't sure if Izuku's youngest zombie girl should count as cute, sweet, or creepy. Don't worry, the paperwork's already been cleared and filed. There won't be any issues at all, Tsukachi's reassured, forcing his wince into a mildly heartening smile. Still, there was something about the detective's reply that seemed off to the hero in training. Now let's go in, shall we? As he pushed open the door for Izuku and his zombie girls, Tsukachi couldn't help but notice something. Was it his paranoia, or had Tei's eyes flickered about the room as the trio walked in? It hadn't been like a curious child in a strange, new environment, as Lily's reaction had been, but more like the cautious, wandering eyes of one on the lookout for potential dangers to their master. Shaking himself from his ludicrous thoughts, Tsukachi followed the three into the morgue. Once everyone was properly situated in the slightly chilled room, Izuku quickly took notice of the two tarp-covered corpses that were lying in state on separate metal tables. One was the size of an adult, the other, an adolescent like himself. The green-haired teen swallowed the knot that was trying to tie his throat closed. Somberly, Tsukachi stepped forward and respectfully pulled back the tarps enough to reveal the faces of the deceased. Izuku had been right on both accounts. The first victim was a middle-aged male, while the second was a teenage girl that couldn't have been any older than he was. Both sported blonde hair, though the hero in training could see that the girl had a few locks that had been dyed red, orange, and green. The similar facial features and hair led Izuku to believe the two were most likely related. Had they been foreigners, or perhaps had foreigners in their ancestry? Thankfully, both corpses had been redressed into hospital gowns. The man's name was Ryuji Nikaido. Tsukachi began, handing a manila folder to Izuku as he stepped between the two deceased. And that was his daughter, Saki. Listening with one ear, Izuku cracked open the folder he'd been given and delved into the information inside. Unfortunately, many pages had been largely redacted, and the multitude of thick, black lines made piecing together anything at all extremely difficult right off the bat. We found them yesterday, early in the morning, after a neighbor reported hearing gunshots. Nikaido-san was already dead when we arrived at the scene. Saki, however, was still clinging to life even in her critical condition. Late last night, she unfortunately succumbed to her injuries, though. Izuku nodded along with the detective's explanation as he flipped through more and more of the pages in his hands. It was like the hardest jigsaw puzzle he'd ever tried to solve, with pieces that had been purposefully removed, but as the seconds ticked by, the green-haired teen began to do the impossible. In his mind's eye, a tale was beginning to weave together from the fragments. And what a tale it was. Nikaido-san was actually a foreigner, as if you couldn't tell, who owned a small workshop that he used to do car and bike repair at. Tsukachi continued, unaware of his intern's thinking. It was a modest lifestyle, and he'd never had any problems with the law. His daughter, on the other hand, had recently become quite the spitfire. Records state she had just taken over a biker gang, Dormy, and was hell-bent on gaining notoriety in their ward. The detective continued reviewing the public information of the two victims, such as Saki having been born in Japan after Nikaido-san had sought asylum, but Izuku's brain had largely blocked the man's voice out at that point. The meager contents of the file, what wasn't written on the pages or was redacted, the fact that he was there at all. An old memory sparked, and it was as if the blanks filled themselves in, and the green-haired teen suddenly saw underneath the underneath. The ongoing theory is that Saki and her Dormy stumbled into the attention of one of the surviving Yakuza clans, most likely one of their younger members or the child of a boss. Tsukachi said, picking his words carefully. We need to validate this theory as soon as possible and then crush the cancer of the old world that's responsible. Izuku could appreciate what the detective was saying and why he was saying it, but Yakuza? Killing this man? He called bullshit. So, Izuku closed the folder, placing it neatly on the edge of the table Nikaido-san rested on. The Verdinet locked eyes with the detective, completely missing how the dim lighting reflected off his sunglasses and gave his appearance an eerie feel. You want me to raise these two, or more specifically Nikaido-san here, so that you can confirm that remnants of SEAL aren't once again operating in our nation? Tsukachi's face instantly lost all color, his heart shot to his throat, and ice flooded his veins. Quick as lightning, the detective snatched back the folder he'd given Izuku and flew through the pages. Surely something hadn't been left unredacted. The UN itself had ordered beyond maximum secrecy to be given to this case. The task was simple: uncover the truth and bring to justice whoever had killed the man who'd long ago done an unrivaled service to the world, and then set All Might loose on any hint of seal that had dared to even breathe in the man's direction. If there'd been any left to be involved, that is. But as the detective finished scanning the last page of the file, he finally came to the understanding that Izuku had deduced the secret truth all on his own, a feat that was in no small way terrifying to the adult. How? Sukachi's short and simple question, highlighting the detective's utter shock and awe, meant the world to Izuku. But the hero in training was quick to squash his elation. If pressed, he'd have had to admit that being a hero fanboy was what had given him the key. It had been over 20 years since All Might had debuted, and quickly gained the worldwide recognized title of the Symbol of Peace. But what many had forgotten was that this achievement had had nothing to do with his crushing organized crime families, dismantling cells of religious fanatics, or picking apart global trafficking rings. The number one hero had received his weighty mantle instead after spearheading the operation that took down the organization known as SEAL. At a time when the world's population had just tipped over in favor of those with quirks, a cabal of the rich and deranged had gathered together in the pursuit of ridding the planet of all who couldn't be classified as normal humans. The lunatics had named themselves SEAL, after the true soul of humanity they claimed to fight for. After a lengthy period of exacerbating societal unrest, proxy battles with heroes across a host of countries, and numerous terrorist attacks targeting those with quirks, in an international statement, SEAL had announced their coup de grace. Missiles. Claiming to be in possession of a virus that could completely eradicate the quirk factor gene, the insane leadership of the anti-quirk organization had boldly announced their plan to unleash selective hellfire on the world, collateral damage be damned. And into the chaos that followed that statement of intent had stepped All Might. While the average citizen could probably only remember the Symbol of Peace's involvement, the hero of heroes hadn't succeeded in his mission alone, of course. Courageous pro-heroes the world over had volunteered to answer the call to take down SEAL, many of the older members of Japan's current top 10 included. When the final battle had commenced on a global scale, All Might had made his official debut by not only saving every endangered citizen unlucky enough to be present at his location, but he had also taken the fight straight to SEAL's leader single-handedly immediately after. But victory wouldn't have been so completely assured if not for the actions of one single, quirkless man erased by history. As the whispers went, it had been an American, an agent of the country's dying CIA, that had cracked SEAL's databases, revealed their information and locations, and even unearthed the existence of a separate, backup missile. Those same whispers also held that it had been that same agent that had gone above and beyond to infiltrate the anti-quirk organization's hidden base, which had been in Japan, and disarm the hitherto unknown missile seconds before its launch. In return, the agent had been rewarded with complete anonymity. The world never learned his name, nor of his involvement, and his country erased his existence from any and all records. There was just one single video that proved he existed at all, just one, where All Might himself thanked an individual by the name of Roy for his assistance. "I don't forget history," Izuku replied, his mind going over fragmented facts, theories, and conspiracies, countless nights of nerding out over all things Hero had unearthed. Now understanding just whose body he stood by, Izuku gave a solemn bow to the remains of one of the first true heroes of modern society. Even when history itself wants to forget. And also, you wouldn't have asked me to use my quirk to solve the murder of just any old mechanic, regardless of who his rebellious daughter might or might not have pissed off. In that moment, Sukachi decided that the teen gravely standing in front of him was too good for a hero program, even UA's, and was probably too good to be kept restrained by any single country in particular either. He might have been a little young, but the detective was seriously considering looking into suggesting the green-haired hero in training be fast-tracked to a leadership position in Interpol. "Midoriya-san, I can't confirm or deny your claims," Sukachi stated, deadly serious. "But I ask that you never speak of your theory to anyone." Grimly holding eye contact with the detective thanks to his sunglasses, Izuku slowly nodded. Understanding shown, the green-haired teen turned to take in the state of the two victims more completely. Ryuji Nikaido, Roy, whatever his name had really been, was obviously past his prime. His once thick hair showed signs of balding, and his protruding waistline spoke of many indulgent meals without worry. Although this would have normally pointed to a target as non-threatening as they came, the well-defined muscles in the man's arms, as well as his calloused hands, indicated the old hero wouldn't have gone down without a fight. If it hadn't been for the 3 bullet holes in the man's torso, he probably could have even succeeded in fending off the attackers that had gone after him and his daughter. In contrast to her father, the girl, Saki, appeared as ferocious as Nikaido-san did, unassuming. She'd been around Izuku's age, as he'd thought, though she was slightly shorter than him. What was visible of her body was littered with scars, many too faded to have been gained in the attack that took her life. She'd been fit, athletic even, and most likely put up one hell of a fight if the scrapes and bruises on her knuckles were any indication. The cause of her death wasn't readily visible, causing Izuku to guess that it must have been some kind of severe internal trauma or the result of a quirk that didn't leave any outward evidence of its use. His own cursory examination finished, Izuku glanced over to Tsukachi, who gave a weak smile in return. "You ready?" the detective asked. Izuku breathed out slowly before opening his eyes, his determination to bring justice to the victims lying before him solidifying in his heart. "Yes." 10 minutes later, Police HQ morgue. Justice sought. Let not the truth be left to rot. Tsukachi stood awkwardly off to the side, having just watched the green-haired teen he'd recently taken under his wing go full necromancer and chant ominously as he injected syringes full of his blood into first the elder Nikaido, then the younger. Truthfully, it had been the freakiest and scariest thing the detective had witnessed in a while, and he lived and breathed a profession that dealt with the horrors that humans could visit upon each other on a daily basis. That the zombie girls had given Izuku looks of fondness as he'd worked his magic hadn't helped his feeling of unease. Tsukachi had to remind himself that this was for justice, that Tae and Lily were tools of that justice, that this was not creating more monsters in the world. Then it happened. Like something out of a classical undead movie from the early 20th century, Saki suddenly sat bolt upright on her table. The blonde zombie's eyes were glowing coals of rage. Her muscles bulged as they tensed, and then, ag! Nothing but a loud, angry groan escaped her snarling lips. Tsukachi honestly didn't know what to think. The coroner's initial report did say that Saki suffered extreme head trauma, which had caused her to slip into the coma she'd ultimately died in. Perhaps the damage had been so terrible that there was just nothing of the girl left to bring back? Had he just given Izuku license to create another Tae? Calm down. You're in the morgue of the Mizudafu police headquarters, Izuku said, attempting to placate the newly risen zombie girl. Or at least, that's what Tsukachi hoped he was trying to do. Grara. The groan this time sounded more annoyed than anything. "No, you're not under arrest," Izuku replied, visibly struggling to find something else acceptable to say. "You were actually brought here as the victim of an attack." Silence. The blonde zombie girl stared hard at the green-haired necromancer. Seconds ticked by. GGGGGHA. Rar GGG. Aghawa. As the newly risen undead descended into a fit of growls and garbled sounds, Lily took a step behind Tae, holding onto the elder zombie girl's shirt as she did so. "Lily thinks Blondie's got some brain damage," the littlest zombie finally said, earning a death glare from her rebellious counterpart. "Lily's sure some of those words aren't real." Gently disconnecting herself from Lily's grip, Tae slowly staggered her way behind the still, thrashing reborn. Maybe, if there was any neural degradation, her tongue and vocal cords wouldn't be able to properly react to her brain's signals. Izuku postulated, only succeeding in getting the distressed zombie girl to begin flailing her arms about. Even only able to groan, it was clear the sounds the blonde was making were demands for answers. Rahararai, the newly risen teen, was now obviously beyond furious, and Tsukachi was sure she'd either try to hit or bite someone if this went on. The winces Midoriya gave after every groan didn't help this fear at all. Gaga. Slap. Faster than Izuku or Tsukachi's eyes could follow, Tay slapped the back of Saki's head with enough force to pitch the blonde zombie forward. The sudden strike was strong enough the newly risen nearly flew off the table she still sat on. Ouch! Why the hell did you do that? Saki spat, glaring at Tay. Crimson eyes widened in abrupt excitement. Oh fuck yeah, I can speak again. A pregnant pause settled over the room as the implications of what just happened processed through the minds of the two still living occupants. Apparently, the only thing Saki's brain had needed was a little kickstart to properly restart. The oddities of quirks had surely struck again. Soon getting over the fact that she could speak again, Saki Nikaido was quick to remind all present why she'd ended up in the situation she had in the first place. Just who do you think you are? The blonde zombie shouted at Tay, once again glaring at the ravenette while doing her best to sound intimidating. Do you want to die? Normally, Saki knew her stare was so intense that any regular scrub off the street just couldn't handle it. But this floozy, whoever the fuck she was, didn't react at all. That was just disrespectful. The rebellious teen stubbornly kept up the staring contest that had silently kicked off between the two, but all too quickly, she found her new rival's seemingly dead eyes unsettling. Grumbling as she conceded to the floozy, for now, Saki turned to look around the room she'd found herself in. Why was her old man sleeping on a table? Whatever. The blonde zombie said as she slid off whatever hard piece of shit she'd been sitting on. Leaning over the still sleeping figure of her old man, Saki began to slap his face. Hey, Pops, get the fuck up already. There's no way in hell we're missing tonight's wrestling match. You promised. Belatedly, Sakachi realized they suddenly had a rather big problem. Ryuji Nikaido wasn't waking up. Midoriya-san, the detective quietly whispered out of the side of his mouth, the rest of his question unspoken but readily understood. What was causing this lack of reaction? I don't know. Izuku managed to whisper back, his mind kicking into overdrive to explain this unexpected occurrence. Of all times for his quirk to act up, it had to be now. Of course he'd fail a hero like Ryuji Nikaido when it mattered most. But as hard as he thought, there was only one difference between the father and daughter that stood out to the green-haired teen. It couldn't be time of death. Instantly, Sakachi felt a wave of guilt wash over him as Saki began to punch at her still unresponsive father, wincing as the blonde zombie girl visibly tried to suppress her growing anxiety when her attacks continued to go unanswered. Of course, there'd be a time limit to a quirk with a zombification attribute as powerful as Midoriya's. Strong quirks oftentimes came with limitations that seemed built in to naturally curb overuse or abuse by their wielders. It was foolish to think the green-haired teen would have been able to raise anyone after any length of time. That meant the scene unraveling before him was partially his fault. He should have asked the hero in training beside him to come in the moment the victims' names had raised a flag in the system. Instead, he'd waited too long, wasting time by worrying about red tape and consequences. Well, now we know there's a time limit. The detective's words were more to himself than the now noticeably distressed necromancer beside him. I didn't know. Izuku managed to choke out, tears beginning to cloud his vision. The green-haired teen didn't need anyone to tell him. He knew he'd wronged yet another person with his quirk. He should have seen an eventuality like this coming. Trying to raise a family in the same room, at the same time, was just asking for trouble. Why hadn't he realized there was a chance one of the victims would fail to return? Why hadn't he considered the grief he'd be forcing on someone as they were separated from their loved one when they otherwise wouldn't have been? This was his entire fault. You idiot, Saki shouted, slamming one last fist into her father's chest. The cracking of bone drew the eyes of Tsukachi and Izuku, causing both to miss the blonde zombie, quickly dragging an arm across her watery eyes. Sniffing sharply and wiping away any remaining trace of weakness, the rebellious teen turned to look at the two men who were now staring wide-eyed at her. Right. Now what? Tsukachi was quick to step forward, glad for an opening to take control of the situation. As sad as it was, he still needed to try and salvage any information that he could and solve the case at hand. It was paramount to the security of the world. Saki Nikaido, in an effort to solve the murder of your father, I would like you to answer my questions. The words were respectful, but commanding. The detective had used these very words and tone countless times before in many cases. Anyone else would have readily agreed in an instant. Unfortunately, Saki had already proven that she wasn't like anyone else. The blonde zombie threw a baleful glare at the man she could just tell was a cop. Her distrust and dislike of authority figures was plain as day. And why the fuck would I cooperate with a filthy donut eater? What's wrong with eating donuts? Lily innocently asked, now behind Izuku. The brunette's confusion at the phrase was clear to see in her big ruby gaze. It's actually a slur aimed at street cops, Izuku quietly corrected, doing his best to minimize the influence of Saki's vulgarity on his cutest little assistant. Redirecting his attention to the newly raised zombie girl, the green-haired teen raised his voice to be heard. Tsukachi-san is actually a detective, though. Oh, so a glorified donut eater then. The rebellious blonde zombie seemed to be quite adamant on being uncooperative. Slap. Saki stumbled forward as Tay sharply slapped the back of her head. Again. Gaha. Tay's follow-up groan seemed to surprise the rebellious girl, or at least it caught her attention long enough to give her pause. Who healed me? Saki asked, surprising Tsukachi as the detective only now realized the daughter of one of the world's most unsung heroes was still unaware that she was undead. Wait, the green bean was the one who healed me. Choosing to ignore the comment on his coloring, Izuku grabbed onto the fact that Saki was no longer glaring at him. Instead, he decided to make the most of the chance he had to speak. Nikaido-san, I know you don't like police officers, Izuku began, keeping his voice as placating as possible, but I need you to cooperate with the detective. The moment the words finished leaving the green-haired teen's lips, Saki's crimson eyes began to shine just a fraction brighter. Tsukachi knew instantly that Izuku's control aspect had taken root. You have to answer all of Tsukachi-san's questions with the truth. By the sound of it, Izuku knew as well. Saki tried her best to resist, to make a smart-ass comment and refuse. It was evident by the gnashing of the blonde's teeth and the tense set of her shoulders as she shook in place. The newly risen threw every ounce of her willpower and years of rebellion behind her effort, and only lasted for 1 second. Fine, Saki shouted, sagging as she gave in to the compulsion, unable to understand why she felt the driving desire to listen to this obvious mama's boy's words. He shouldn't have been so hard to ignore. But only because I owe you big time. Leaning against the table that had until recently carried her dead body, Saki crossed her arms and glared at her audience. So it all started with this pink-haired bitch and a dozen armed shit stains, the blonde zombie began. Immediately, Tsukachi and Izuku were thrown for a loop. As self-proclaimed heralds of true humans, Seal would never have embraced or employed someone with features outside of what used to be considered normal. And pink hair, even today, wasn't that normal. The cunt came waltzing into the shop, and I shit you not said in the most haughty as fuck tone, that Pops and I had been marked for death because we were foreigners, Saki continued, slowly regaining her anger at just the memory of what had happened. I'm half Japanese, damn it. Anyway, apparently we were going to serve as practice for a new generation of Yakuza enforcers or some shit. As horrible as it sounded, Tsukachi felt himself shudder with relief. It hadn't been Seal. If the newly risen zombie girl could be believed, and based on Midoriya's order she could be, then it looked like it was just a few young-blood Yakuza who'd gotten a lucky drop on the Nikaido family. While a resurgent underworld entity was something to be worried about, it didn't hold a candle to how much trouble they would have all been in if the anti-quirk organization had somehow survived after all this time. Or so he thought. If the fuckers thought they'd have an easy job at lynching Pops and I, well, we were quick to re-educate them. Saki pushed forward with a wicked smirk. I've never seen Pops move so fast. I hardly blinked, and he'd already taken a drill to 3 of the fuckers. Of course, I wasn't going to be left out. I grabbed the nearest wrench and started swinging just as my old man picked up a tire iron. Listening to the bloody details, Izuku felt himself pale. Even after all these years later, and being out of practice, Ryuji Nikaido sounded like he'd been a true force to be reckoned with. And Saki herself wasn't one to ignore, if her prowess with that wrench was anything to go by. Then that bitch got involved, and everything went to hell, Saki growled, snapping Izuku from his thoughts. The blonde zombie flicked her eyes to her father's corpse, before the crimson orbs glowed again and she refocusing on her audience. Out of nowhere the pink fuck pulls out 2 Uzis and starts spraying. I ducked behind a desk, but the dumb bitch nicked the shelves above me, and that shit came crashing down. Last thing I heard was Pops shouting my name. Silence reigned once more as the two living occupants of the room digested what they'd just been told. Then Izuku blinked, realizing something from the case file that didn't match up with Saki's story. "Tsukachi-san," the green-haired teen called out, quickly putting two and two together and getting fish. I think we're short a dozen bodies. Normally, it wouldn't have been unheard of for members of the underworld to spirit away their dead from a crime scene in an effort to keep the police guessing as to their numbers and identities. But the incident with the Nikaido family was different. The police had arrived at the scene relatively quickly, as their address and the surrounding area had been under a long-standing high alert for obvious reasons. That meant that the bodies of the assailants had been moved at inhuman speeds, and any traces of their skirmish had been wiped away as well. As troubling as that is, Tsukachi murmured, a rather determined look growing in his eyes. "Nikaido-san, can you describe the woman in detail?" Saki resisted for a fraction of a second before huffing in annoyance. The urge to obey the mama's boy's orders had reasserted itself quickly. "Fine, whatever," the blonde zombie girl snapped, obviously unhappy that she had to help a member of the police force. Although, if it got her another round with the pink bitch, she could swallow her dislike and assist for now. There's not much to say. The bitch wasn't exactly tall or short. She was pale as fuck. Her shitty pink hair was so long she had it pulled back into two loopy-looking buns, or some shit. There were two ugly-ass moles under her eyes. Oh, and the cunt acted like a royal fucking bitch. "Nikaido-san," Izuku chastised, having already covered Lily's ears as soon as the blonde zombie girl had started her colorful commentary. "Language." Saki raised a brow at the mama's boy's reaction. She seemed to be unable to see what the problem was, as if she hadn't been using language vulgar enough to give a sailor a run for his money. "What?" the blonde zombie girl asked. "It's just adult language. Why do you even bring a shrimp with you anyway?" "Shrimp?" Lily nearly shrieked in outrage. "Lily is not a shrimp. Lily is an idol support heroine." Saki scoffed at the claim, dismissing it while eyeing the vibrant pink outfit her new target wore. She was not impressed. "Whatever you say, Shrimpy." As the two zombie girls devolved into a verbal catfight, Tsukachi kept going over the short description he'd been given. Double-checking what he'd written down in his pocket notebook, the detective smiled like a deranged psychopath. He knew exactly who this woman was. And if Izuku got Saki to testify, he might finally be able to bring her to justice. Later that day, Police HQ. "What do you mean I'm dead?" When Izuku and the zombie girls had been left inside the detective's office due to Tsukachi needing to go order the arrest of a suspect matching Saki's description, the green-haired teen hadn't expected the situation to so quickly shift to a more immediate concern. He hadn't realized the rebellious blonde zombie girl still hadn't noticed her undead state. And, judging by the volume of her scream, which had surely been heard by the officers outside in their cubicles, was also unable to accept that fact as well. The hero in training couldn't blame her, though. Saki had seemed to have had quite the strong will to survive when she'd been alive. "Nikaido-san, please." Izuku tried hesitantly, flailing. He had no idea what to do with a zombie girl that was freaking out. "Try to relax." "Relax my ass." "Maybe after using a horse-sized dildo." Saki's choice of language remained colorful at least. "I can't be dead. I have a gang to lead." Saki roared, blowing through whatever calm Izuku had tried to create. The blonde zombie girl checked her non-existent pulse, slamming into a rather violent denial phase. "I can't die until my gang conquers Japan. I haven't even conquered my own ward yet." Lily, once again hiding behind Izuku's protective form, tugged on her Nissan's vest. The green-haired teen turned to give the littlest zombie his attention, glad for a moment's reprieve from the panicking blonde. "Aizu and I," Lily mumbled. "Lily thinks maybe Blondie might need to take a permanent nap." "Shut it, Shrimpy." Apparently her state of panic did nothing to detract from Saki's rather good hearing. "I even had plans for a hot threesome with my boyfriend tomorrow." The blonde zombie girl's words froze not only Izuku, but a few of the officers who'd been listening in from out in the bullpens. "Oh wait, maybe I can still get some. That fucker's got some weird tastes. Now where's my phone? And my fucking Tamagotchi? That critter better not have died already." Izuku could say, without a shred of doubt, that he'd never met someone as rowdy, or scary as Saki Nikaido before. Suddenly, the door to the office flew open, Tsukachi walking through like a man on a mission. Or he would have, if he didn't have such an unsettling grin stretched across his face. "We have our suspect," the detective announced, staring intently at the blonde zombie girl. "Ready to identify your murderer? Can I break her legs?" Saki asked, sending an equally unnerving grin right back. Izuku was not okay with that response. It was said far too seriously for comfort. But the thinking pose Tsukachi adopted in response was even more worrisome to the green-haired teen. "If she attacks you first, maybe," the detective answered. That definitely didn't sit well with Izuku, but there was little arguing would do at the moment. The walk to the interrogation room was a quick one, and it looked every bit the same as every movie and TV show Izuku had ever watched had depicted. The two-way mirror that allowed the group to see inside the room's other half was also just as the green-haired teen had always imagined it'd be. But there was no room for wonder in the young necromancer's heart as he stood there, watching the woman on the other side. "Yep, that's the bitch sure enough," Saki said without prompt or preamble. The blonde zombie girl looked ready to beat the ever-living shit out of the one who'd murdered her and her father. "That's Ikaruga, no family name," Tsukachi revealed, looking almost impatient to get at the woman himself. "Registered quirkless, and no priors that have ever stuck." Confused at the detective's wording, Izuku shot the man a look of puzzlement. Understanding his intern's lack of experience, Tsukachi went on. "She's been seen around plenty of murder scenes, quite literally moments after the crime was committed in some cases, but there's never been any evidence that could tie her to them," the detective explained, "nor have there been any witnesses that could pin her to the right locations at the right times. Hell, we've never even caught her being seen wielding any sort of weapon before." Izuku had wanted to pay attention to the valuable information Tsukachi was giving him. He really had. But as soon as the green-haired teen had seen a confident smirk settle on the rosette's aristocratic face, his body had been set on fire. He was boiling, his cursed blood searing his veins as his heart drummed a war song of enacting bloody justice on this woman who thought herself above the law. Beside her master, Tay growled lowly. The woman in the interrogation room was obviously not unknown to Izuku's first partner either. "Are you ready to confront her?" Tsukachi questioned, a quirk of the detective's lips the only hint he expected the sight of one of her victims walking around to humorously shock the pink-haired woman into spilling her guts. The man wasn't expecting the glowering gazes full of hatred that his charge and two of his zombie girls were directing at the probable assassin. Lily might have glared too, but the brunette was too short to see over the two-way window's sill. Instead, she stood behind Izuku and Tay, an adorably serious pout on her face. "We are," Izuku answered firmly. Something in the brunette's tone caused the detective to shiver, and the man actually felt a sliver of fear for the safety of the woman he was about to interrogate. "All right, let's do this," Tsukachi said, grabbing the doorknob of the sealed entrance to the room's other side. Steeling himself for whatever happened next, the detective grimly looked forward as he opened the door. "Midoriya-san, may I introduce you to Ikaruga, the Trinity Raven." A sinister trial. Ikaruga, better known to the underworld of Japan as the Trinity Raven, was in no way having a good time. What started as an easy and quick contract on Friday had turned into a mess and a half of a headache. How her assignment of supervising a handful of greenhorn Yakuza brats through their first enforcing, only intervening if strictly necessary, had turned into yet another trip to the Mizuta-fu police station was beyond her. Honestly, educating the runts on proper cleanup should have been the hardest part of the job. Unfortunately for her, it turned out that their victims had been nothing like the shit scouts had reported. Granted, she'd expected the girl to give the brats a bit of a fight thanks to her position as a small-time gang leader, but the ferocity their main target had displayed had completely blindsided her. Surely anyone with the skill to mow down a small mob in under 2 minutes would have been someone she knew of, but the grease and oil-covered Ryuji Nikaido had proven himself to have been a highly volatile, unknown variable. She hated when she was forced to step in, especially when the job was supposed to be an easy one for her. It had been her quirk that had saved her. The ability to conceal foreign objects using her body alone had always been Ikaruga's ace, even before she'd taken her first steps into the illustrious occupation of fixer. When taking in her slight frame, No one ever suspected she carried a veritable armory on her person at all times. Neither law enforcement nor her victims had ever realized the truth of the beauty marks that littered her body. And for obvious reasons, no one ever looked at them too closely, let alone touched them. There was one negative to her quirk, however. She was the favorite choice when a prospective client needed to clean up their bloody messes. She abhorred getting dirty. In the end, her ability hadn't been enough, though. While it was true the father and daughter duo had been killed, the former by her own hand and the latter by an engine block dropping on her head, the job was ultimately a failure. Even a silver tongue like herself couldn't spin the situation to her benefit when all the idiots she had been hired to babysit ended up dead. But the crux of her problems this time, and what made matters worse, was that she hadn't had time to properly sanitize the scene before she'd had to flee. Just as she'd gotten the last of her bloodlust under control, she'd begun to hear far too much activity, much too close for comfort. For the first time in her career, she, Ikaruga, the Trinity Raven, had been forced to leave behind used shells and discarded magazines for the law to find. The only saving grace was that she'd been able to conceal the bodies of the useless shits she'd been supervising. Even that wasn't a complete victory, as just the thought of the corpses sitting on her skin made her feel dirty. And she had to keep the stiffs on her until Monday, the earliest that Yakuza brat who'd hired her would agree to meet her. The paranoid shit was convinced moving any earlier would lead to him being traced. Luckily for him, he'd realized his demand entailed additional compensation, though in reality it'd be all she'd realistically receive since the primary job had fallen through. Ikaruga internally grumbled at the very thought. Such a paltry sum wouldn't even cover the cost of restocking the ammunition she'd used. Who would have thought that a mechanic, a fat one at that, would have been that hard to hit? Even ditching one of her Uzi and pulling out her execution pistol hadn't helped. In the end, it had taken distracting the bastard by aiming at the down blonde girl for her target to hold still long enough for her to put a bullet in him. That alone hurt her pride. "I hate sloppy jobs," Ikaruga muttered, keeping her voice as low as possible. Even her general disposition of confidence was unable to keep her emotions completely bottled up at the moment. Only the knowledge that she couldn't afford to screw things up further allowed the pinkette to focus and keep her cool. She hadn't even been able to leave her signature. At least, not in the elegant form she preferred. One given the privilege of dying as her target deserved a tasteful death, not the vulgar sham she'd been forced to make do with earlier. With one shot to the heart for a confirmed kill, a second to a lung, and a third to the liver. The mark of the Trinity Raven was a masterpiece that signaled a perfectly completed job by a legend. The longer she mulled over her current situation, the more Ikaruga compared it to the fiasco that had become her hunt for that fucktoy the Yakuza had once allowed to escape. At least she was familiar with where she was at the moment. The Mizudafu police station's interrogation room? She could have laughed. The pinkette had graced the drab chamber countless times in the past. Her perchance for appearing at the scenes of her work's aftermath had always been a planned advertisement of her services to Japan's underworld. Nothing could ever be pinned on her, no matter how obvious her involvement might have been, and every time she'd been taken away, she'd just appear the next day, free as a bird. The Trinity Raven had easily become known as the one to hire when you wanted no witnesses and no evidence, and then repeat service. And today would be no different. The interrogation room's door opened, and the annoying Detective Ikaruga had been jerking around for a few years entered. Like she'd thought, this time would be no. The detective held the door open. "Midoriya-san, may I introduce you to Ikaruga, the Trinity Raven," the detective said, only making the pinkette smirk. Bringing in someone new was also a tactic the police had tried before. But just as back then, it wouldn't do them any good now. Ikaruga's olive gaze stared flatly at the green-haired teen that walked in, round sunglasses reflecting the fluorescent glare from the lights above them. The newbie looked somewhat familiar. "Must you insist on that strange name, detective?" Ikaruga asked, voice pitched in mock hurt. The slightest quirk of one of her thin eyebrows was the only hint the woman was finding pleasure in continuing their farcical dance. "Honestly, you make it sound as if you think I'm some famous killer or something." Right as the pinkette prepared her usual comeback to the detective's aggravated response, two more newcomers entered the room. Taking in the appearances of this latest duo, Ikaruga felt her stomach plummet. "I am possible." Before the normally unflappable underworld cleaner stood two of her marks. Two marks that the Pinkette had been sure only moments ago had been properly dealt with. Even if the first had somehow survived an engine block to the head, there was no way she could have recovered from such a wound so quickly. The second, she'd ensured her death. She'd unloaded every bullet she'd had on her at the time into the girl after all. And yet, here they both stood, glaring at her with crimson eyes burning with vindication. "What's up, bitch?" the blonde girl with colored highlights greeted, an evil smile pulling at her pale cheeks. Ikaruga needed no further prompting. There were two witnesses to her work in the room, likely three. The green-haired brat had to have been the one the Pinkette had thought she'd taken care of the night she'd caught up with the runaway fucktoy. If her signature 3 shots hadn't killed him, he was probably some kind of healer, which explained not enough. And the damn detective was now smiling like a cat that had gotten the cream. Ikaruga knew at that moment she was out of options. She'd have to kill everyone in the room. Now, she could worry about fleeing the country later. "Ikaruga, Trinity Raven," Tsukachi said, barely containing the smugness that was threatening his professionalism. "These three are..." Bang! Bang! The detective's introduction was cut short as the Pinkette he'd thought was unarmed and cuffed to his interrogation table suddenly shot to her feet, pulled a high-caliber pistol out of nothing, and opened fire. Bang! 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 In a move too quick for Tsukachi to follow, Izuku tackled the detective to the ground. In that same instant, Tei shot across the room and reached for the hands of the woman who dared endanger the life of her master. Snap! Gahahawa! The blood-curdling scream that tore from Ikaruga's mouth, followed by a steady stream of expletive-heavy whimperings, left the room in near silence as the only other living occupants desperately tried to take stock of the situation. Managing to gather himself just a few seconds quicker than his intern, Tsukachi compartmentalized how close he'd come to death and sat up. Pulling the green-haired necromancer under his care up with him, the detective took stock of the room. The most shocking detail he noticed was that the now verified assassin Ikaruga was sniveling and thrashing around while held in place by the undead Ravinette Tei. The Pinkette was being contained by gratuitous force being applied to her, now clearly broken arms. Jagged bone protruded from her forearms provided a gruesome indication of the strength of those under the influence of his intern's quirk. "Are you all right, Tsukachi-san?" Izuku asked over the noise of the captive assassin. The green-haired teen was unable to mask his concern, worried out of his mind that he'd managed to fail twice in one day. "I'm all right," Tsukachi replied, patting himself down when he felt no sharp pains of a gunshot wound. "How about?" The detective's own concern died on his lips as the man finally noticed the bullet hole in his intern, right below the green-haired teen's armpit. Tsukachi blinked at the sight, unable to process firstly that the teen under his care had been hurt, and secondly that there was far too little blood coming from the wound for its size. The man's shock turned to horror as Izuku literally spat out a bullet, as if it were nothing. "I'll be fine," the green-haired necromancer said easily, as if he hadn't just been shot. Cringing at the coppery taste left on his tongue, Izuku turned to the undead in the room. "Tei-chan, Nikaido-san, how are you two holding up?" The growling Tei paused in manhandling the now terrified assassin to stare unblinkingly at her master. After a moment, Izuku's first partner cocked her head to the side. When the green-haired teen smiled gently in return, the Ravinette turned back to Pinkette she'd captured, growling once more. Saki merely poked at a new hole in her chest, reluctantly impressed at her foe's skill. "The cunt managed to nail me right in the heart," the blonde replied. "Nothing serious, all things considered." Taking a moment to savor the feeling of invincibility flooding her as she watched the wound slowly close, Saki turned to the green bean that had brought her back to life. Another wicked grin spread across her face. "Wonder Girl here seems about ready to rip into the bitch," the rebellious zombie girl said. "Can you tell her to leave some for me?" Izuku briefly considered the request. His heart still beat like a war drum, adrenaline and the itch for vengeance pounding in his ears. But, more importantly, there was a promise he'd been unable to keep until now. He felt a dire need to bring justice to Tei and all the other girls out there who had suffered like she had. The animal in front of him had murdered an untold amount of people, and her sentence would not begin here. "Not yet," Izuku decreed, halting Tei's growls and bringing a questioning glare to Saki's eyes. First, we need a confession. The green-haired necromancer had quickly realized that a simple end for the Pinkette wouldn't be enough, not by a long shot. Instead, having the assassin guide the police to all of her clients, bringing down each and every scumbag and abhorrent beast that believed themselves untouchable would be a much more fitting punishment. As a bonus, they might even be able to rescue those who still had a chance. Well, with what she did just now, we kind of have carte blanche with her at the moment, Tsukachi revealed, dusting himself off. We really don't need anything else for a trial, but additional information never hurt. She killed Tei-chan. Izuku suddenly interrupted, subconsciously directing his blood to consume the epinephrine he could feel his body producing. The green-haired teen didn't want his anger to show in front of the detective if he could help it. That means she might be connected to some of the same people that hurt Lily-chan. Blinking at the sight of his intern struggling to contain his emotions, Tsukachi sighed regretfully as he placed a hand on the young necromancer's shoulder. Midoriya-san, the detective said, gaining the green-haired teen's attention. That kind of information usually only comes about by making a plea deal. At first, Izuku gave no reaction to Tsukachi's words, and the man briefly considered repeating himself. Then the young necromancer tensed, and the detective felt a chill creep down his spine as the green-haired teen turned to him with a smile. Tsukachi-san, forgive me if this is pushing things too far, but... Izuku paused, appreciating the sight of Ikaruga still flailing helplessly in Tei's grip, desperate for escape. Would making use of my blood as a truth serum of sorts be admissible? We have to heal her anyway, right? The silence that followed weighed down heavily on the living occupants of the room, like the inevitability of the grave. Even Ikaruga fell silent, her face now twisted in horror in addition to the blinding agony she felt. The Pinkette was no fool. She knew that quirks of such power weren't unheard of. She also knew that the precedents for the use of such quirks had long ago been established in Japan's justice system. As long as the brat's quirk was legitimate, then any information coerced from her lips would be valid. Worse, it sounded as if the evidence of her treatment would be erased as well, leaving her no way to defend herself in court. It should be possible, Tsukachi murmured, mentally going over the laws, protocols, and other legalities of such a tactic. Everything would have to be recorded, of course, and once you give the approved orders, you'd have to leave the room. For impartiality's sake. The fact that the detective didn't immediately discount the green-haired monster's question and even outlined how they'd go about implementing it was akin to a death sentence in Ikaruga's eyes. The Pinkette shuddered. Betraying one's clients, coerced or not, always ensured the offending party met a messy and oftentimes nightmarish end. Understood, Izuku replied after giving some thought to the detective's words. It made sense that he wouldn't be allowed to sit in on an interrogation that used an aspect of his quirk. The police had to prevent any chances of the biased confession defense coming into play. Nodding, the green-haired teen looked to Tei and Saki. Bring her here. Crimson eyes now glowing scarlet, Tei began to drag the Pinkette she held back to the interrogation table. Ikaruga renewed her struggles, ignoring the searing pain shooting through her shattered arms. Her wild thrashing managed to get one of her legs in a position to strike at the undead Ravenette. Kicking out, the panicking assassin only landed 3 weak hits before Saki, eyes also aglow, caught the offending limb. Crack! Ga-awa! Ikaruga screamed again, a fresh wave of pain coursing through her body. Her now broken knee could no longer support her weight, and the Pinkette sagged as she was manhandled. With no further resistance, Tei roughly shoved the quivering assassin back into her chair. Why you? You can't do this. Ikaruga forced out through teeth grit in pain and fear. I have rights. The Pinkette couldn't process what was happening. She'd been told, and confirmed, that the runaway fucktoy had been a quirkless weakling. Anyone should have been able to push her around, and often had by all accounts. But now the Ravenette was some kind of hulking behemoth wrapped in a petite package, an unstoppable force. And the mongrel wasn't that far behind in freakishness either. Leader of her own gang or not, reports had stated that the blonde's quirk dealt with machinery, not anything that could break bones like they were twigs. She hadn't shown this strength when she'd apparently failed to kill her either. Then the assassin noticed it. There was a small hole in the shirt the blonde half-breed wore, right at chest level. A bullet hole if she'd ever seen one. So she hadn't missed? Abruptly, the night she'd been forced to hunt down the fucktoy flashed before Ikaruga's eyes again. She remembered executing the brat who'd thought himself a hero with her signature 3 shots. She remembered unloading all of her frustrations on the runaway, 2 whole clips worth. The blood that had leaked from the brat had shown his quirk wasn't being bulletproof, and the quirkless fucktoy had been left at death's door on purpose, to suffer before meeting her end. As the memories faded, Ikaruga's mind flittered to the words of her contact at the local hospital. The mongrel had been declared dead overnight, unable to recover from the head wound the engine block had caused. And yet, all 3 were here. Mind the glass. Wham! The sudden warning came a second before Ikaruga felt a hand grab her by the back of the head and slam her face into the desk she'd been forced to sit at. The force of the blow was enough to break her nose and crack the teeth at the front of her mouth. Dazed, the assassin hazily thought on how no glass had been involved. Perhaps that had been a joke? Wug! Ikaruga groaned, the room beginning to spin. Weakly pushing against the hand holding her head down, the pinkette managed to turn just enough to see the culprit of her latest pain. A brief surge of fury lit through the caught assassin when she realized it had been the mongrel that had slammed her down. Then the door to the interrogation room opened, and a small girl with blue pigtails entered holding a small box in her hands. Lily was glad that she could now enter the room her big brother had gone into. Previously, he'd ordered her to stay outside until he knew the situation was under control. If anything had gone wrong, she might have been targeted as the easiest to take hostage. When the littlest zombie had felt a tug in her chest after a number of minutes, she'd guessed her big brother had gotten a handle on everything. Feeling that she could enter the room on her own accord, the Bluinette unthinkingly brought her big brother's special medkit along with her. To those still among the living in the room, the sight of Lily Hashikawa walking into the interrogation room with scarlet eyes aglow was enough to freeze them once again. It seemed Izuku's blood was quite potent, if one of those under control could tell when he needed them before the teen himself did. Thank you, Lily-chan. Izuku started, shaking off the off-putting sight of Lily's eyes glowing. He hadn't given her an order besides wait for him recently, had he? Graciously taking the med kit, the green-haired teen gave his cute assistant a loving head pat. Now, let's help Miss Villain here feel more at ease with aiding the side of justice for once. Ikaruga, known far and wide in the underworld as the feared assassin Trinity Raven, watched on in muted horror and dread as the brat she'd long ago discounted took a small syringe from the box he'd been handed and plunged the needle into the crook of his arm. With both of her arms, a leg, and her nose broken, not to mention 2 inhumanly powerful girls holding her down, the pinkette had no choice but to stare as the green-haired monster stepped towards her with the now blood-filled syringe. Looking up from her lowered position bent over the table, Ikaruga suddenly gasped. With the room's fluorescent light behind him, the figure coming at her was cast in silhouette, mostly. Somehow, someway, red eyes blazed through the shadow, twin moons of avenging scarlet. Below, a frighteningly white smile carved through the dark form as well. For the rest of her days, the pinkette would never forget the nightmarish sight as it approached her. Nor would the words it spoke ever leave her. Despise me, forgive me, resign yourself. Later, police HQ rest area. Izuku, Tae, and Lily sat as comfortably as possible in the small corner of the police headquarters that served as the rest area for those waiting. The space came equipped with a coffee machine, which Izuku had made use of, and donuts that had been delivered by a younger officer only a few minutes ago. Lily had found the presence of the snack hilarious. This has been, Izuku began, taking a sip from his mug of fresh coffee, a rough day. Tsukachi had ordered the green-haired teen and his 2 official partners to leave the room shortly after his blood had taken hold in Ikaruga's body. The detective had kindly suggested that the 3 take a well-deserved break while he worked over the assassin. Saki had been asked to remain behind, a temporary security guard in the unlikely case that the pinkette broke free from the effects of control or it burned out sooner than expected. While they waited, Izuku wondered if using his blood like this would be cleared in the future for further use. Although the young necromancer still felt ill at ease using his quirk forcibly on others, if it was for the benefit of all, for justice, he supposed he could learn to live with it. Gragra, Tae's groan, almost questioning in tone, earned a wince from the introspective hero in training. Lily agrees. Telling Inko Mama might not be a good idea, Lily added, throwing her own 2 yen in on the matter. Turning her focus to the pink icing-covered donut in her hands, the littlest zombie took a cute bite of the sugary treat. Izuku sighed. Lily had a point. His mother didn't need any more stress or shock in her life if he could help it. Not to mention he'd really rather avoid another reprimand from her as well. Yeah, the young necromancer conceded. Not mentioning the bullets is probably for the best. Tay nodded slowly as she bit into her own donut, chocolate icing with sprinkles. While neither zombie girl truly needed to eat food, it had seemed rude to Izuku to reject the treats when the young officer had offered. The green-haired teen might have felt differently if he'd known the gifts had only been purchased in the mistaken belief that they'd be enough to keep his undead partners pacified and too full to consider biting humans. Hey, so I heard old Tsukachi actually came to work today. Izuku heard one of the officers sitting at a bullpen around the corner say. Only half paying attention due to the inclusion of the detective in the discussion, the green-haired teen took a sip of his coffee as he listened in. That's kind of unusual. It's that time of the month, right? What? You think he had a fight with his old lady or something? Izuku forced himself to swallow instead of spit up his coffee. What was he listening to? The young necromancer didn't know what to do. On one hand, it was hard for him to think of a man as dedicated to his work as the detective as being married. On the other, it made sense that such dedication would cause a fight considering the workload any case potentially involving Seal would generate. Suddenly, Izuku felt righteous indignation for Tsukachi. Surely the man wanted to be able to spend more time with his family. He didn't need his co-workers talking behind his back. Nah, I think he just had some high-profile case or something came up. All that hero liaison shit he does, you know. Another officer replied, sounding bored. Besides, Loverboy already went to see the missus earlier this week, remember? Izuku knew it was none of his business, but the conversation he was eavesdropping on made no sense. He could understand that most of the people in the building, even if they were police, wouldn't know the particulars regarding the Nikaido case, but what relevance did Tsukachi going to see his wife earlier in the week have to do with anything? Although, why the detective apparently only saw her periodically by the sounds of it was almost more of a mystery. I don't know. The first officer weaseled. Only 6 hours of quality time? Instead of the usual 2 days? Doesn't sound like an equal trade if you ask me. At that point, Izuku prudently chose to extract his attention from the conversation. Prying into the private life of the man who'd so graciously given him a chance was no way to show appreciation. It was thanks to Tsukachi he'd been given an opportunity to study his accursed quirk in a relatively safe environment and learn how to harness it for the betterment of society. He owed it to the man to at least keep out of his personal affairs. Izuku Midoriya? The unexpected call of a somewhat familiar-looking female officer snapped the green-haired necromancer from his musings. As the young woman approached, the hero in training didn't fail to notice how her eyes never left Tay. Yes, Izuku replied, managing to hold in his usual stuttering. The officer might have seemed okay, but the green-haired teen had no idea if she knew what had happened in the interrogation room or not, and if he could be in trouble for it. The fact he refused to put a leash, literally speaking, on Tay could have also set off some of the more wary officers as well. Detective Tsukachi has instructed me to give you a tour of the station, the officer announced, finally taking her eyes off Tay. Apparently whatever he's involved with at the moment will take more time than originally expected, and he didn't want you to waste your time just sitting here. Izuku sighed in relief. He wasn't in trouble. Now standing at ease, the female officer flicked her gaze back to the older of the 2 zombie girls as she waited for the detectives in turn to respond. She really didn't want to do this. Hell, if she'd been told the undead would be roaming the precinct that day, she would have called in sick or used what little PTO she'd scrounged up to avoid them. It had been months since she'd last seen the young necromancer and the blood-covered ravenette he'd brought back from the dead, but somehow the walking corpse hadn't rotted away a bit. How could a dead girl look healthier than her? Still, Scuttlebutt held that the boy was the reason there'd been a major break in a collection of murder cases recently. Surely the kid couldn't be that bad if the rumors were true, right? Neither Izuku nor the policewoman knew it, but at that moment, thanks to the green-haired necromancer's quirk, Ikaruga was spilling her guts to an increasingly satisfied Tsukachi. His first rather simple question had the pinkette explaining the nature of her illicitly hidden quirk. The assassin had revealed the Yakuza corpses she'd been concealing and a sizable amount of highly illegal weapons and ammunitions without issue. Now the once haughty Trinity Raven couldn't even shed a silent tear as she was forced to reveal the names and locations of every employer and provider she'd ever come into contact with, while the detective wrote every word down. Belatedly realizing he'd gotten lost in his own head again, when he'd realized he wasn't being scolded, Izuku snapped to attention and nodded at the still waiting officer standing before him. A tour of the station sounded perfect. As the green-haired teen followed the nervous female officer along with his two partners, he was completely unaware of the metal Tsukachi was now planning on recommending him for, or the all-you-can-eat buffet visit the detective would insist on paying for in the future. Late evening, Midoriya residence, sunset. After a long day at the Mizudafu police station, Izuku and the now 3 undead he oversaw managed to return to the green-haired teen's home without incident. This was due in part to the discovery that Saki could pass as a member of the living for the time being after she'd been given a plain track suit by the police force to wear. Besides raising the blonde delinquent and bringing down the Trinity Raven, the rest of the young necromancer's day had passed by fairly smoothly. There'd been a crash course on office procedure, the protocols of which Izuku had found laughably easy to follow. There'd been an intensive lesson on why heroes should never treat paperwork and filing a case as easy or boring, which he'd readily agreed with. There'd even been a rather interesting lecture on human rights and why heroes going all out on villains should be discouraged. Well, that last one had been given by the police chief of Hosu, Kenji Tsurigami, who'd been visiting for a Q&A panel. The dog-faced man's words would have had more impact if he hadn't been smiling as he'd said them. Mentioning how Interpol complimented Mizudafu's department for handing over packages in acceptable condition didn't help either. The highlight of the day had definitely been watching as Ikaruga was dragged away by agents of said international organization, loudly begging to become his slave instead of facing her sentence. Izuku had shivered when he'd later been told of what the pinkette was to face, being sent to the villainously obscure and indefinitely detained, heavy environmental last-line prison. It was a fate so terrible even the dark web hesitated to speak of it. Void Hell Prison was rumored to be terrible, worse than even Tartarus, and could apparently break even the most hardened of villains just by name alone, never mind being sent to it. There were still whispers that the UN's public special prison could be broken out of, but those who were sent to Void Hell never returned and were never heard from again either. Other than that event, watching grown men and women gush over Lily, even knowing of her state of existence, had been a heartwarming sight for the green-haired teen. The littlest zombie had received so many head pats from the officers that she'd seemed supercharged into a hyperactive state of being afterwards. Conversely, everyone had avoided Tay at all cost, which, all things considered, was probably for the best. Well, I guess there's been worse first days, Izuku said, opening the door to the Midoriya family's home. I'm home. The green-haired teen had always dreamed of one day saying the traditional phrase to someone other than his mother. Recently, that dream had matured into including Tu as the first person he'd see upon returning from a hard day's work. Although, with the both of them hopefully becoming pro-heroes one day, the reality would probably be much more complicated. Oh well. It took Izuku a full second to realize his beloved froggy girlfriend was standing in front of him at that very moment. T.S. Tsuchan. Izuku stuttered, overcome with shock, joy, and for some reason worry. Too late. He realized the frog girl's eyes weren't even focused on him, but someone else. Someone behind him. I can explain. Izuku deadpanned, too panicked to even express emotion at the moment. Welcome home, Tu said flatly, returning her blank gaze to the green-haired teen. Please do. Izuku felt a chill run down his spine. The Trinity Raven had nothing on his girlfriend. Wow. Saki chuckled, smirking at the scene unfurling before her. The blonde zombie decided to have some fun. It served the green bean right for bringing her back as a fucking servant. Now that's a super controlling buy. Slap. The delinquent's crass humor was interrupted as Tay slapped the back of the blonde's head yet again, instinctually protecting her master from any and everything she could. This is Saki Nikaido, Izuku began, planning on sharing as much as he was allowed with his girlfriend. I know how it looks, but she's actually dead, just like Tae and Lily-chan. Later, it took 20 minutes of panicked rambling, but by the end Izuku had managed to explain most of the situation with Saki Tatu. He'd covered the blonde's backstory, the reason she was risen, and most importantly, the reason she was being kept around for at least a month. It turned out that Interpol would be sending an agent at some point to take a final statement and picture before dispensing some sort of compensation for their failure in protecting the Nikaido family. Of course, Izuku left out any mention of gunshot wounds or interrogations. He especially left out how good it had felt to use his quirk on an unwilling Ikaruga. In much the same way, he knew his mother had received an even further watered-down version of the day from Tsukachi, the detective choosing to put emphasis more on the green-haired teen's near-perfect handling of paperwork and case filing than his crash course in interrogation practices. "I understand," Tsu said suddenly, lightly squishing the small frog plush in her hands. "I'm sorry for getting upset, Karo." While that wasn't the word Izuku would have used, the green-haired teen could see where his girlfriend was coming from. He'd arrived home later than he said he'd be, accompanied by what appeared to be a normal, pretty girl their age. If their roles had been reversed, the young necromancer was sure he'd have reacted much worse. During the explaining, the group had moved to Izuku's room, and he and Tsu had somehow ended up sitting on his bed. The two were so close they could feel the other's body heat, and as the hero in training gazed into wide, froggy eyes, he could tell his Tsu-chan needed a hug. It went without saying that the door to the room was open. Both Inko and Baru were having tea in the living room, close enough they could hear anything happening in the rest of the apartment at all times. On top of that, with the zombie girls also in the room, the green duo found the thought of going any farther than hugs and kisses completely embarrassing and pretty much impossible. So, Izuku trailed off, trying to find a way to break the awkward silence that had fallen between himself and Tsu. Stealing his resolve, the green-haired teen dug deep and found the courage to wrap an arm around his beloved girlfriend's shoulder. "What do you think of my room?" "Nailed it." Tsu easily read the attempt at shifting the mood for what it was, and did her best to show her appreciation and enjoyment of the attention she was receiving. Without reservation, the froggy teen leaned against her boyfriend, laying her head on his shoulder. It was moments like these that the amphibious young woman was grateful Izuku didn't seem to idolize having a completely rock-hard body like many boys his age. "I like it," Tsu replied, dropping her frog plush on the bed's pillow. Gathering her own courage, the frog girl placed her hands over Izuku's, threading their fingers together. "It reflects you perfectly. It's balanced, not too clinical or sentimental, Karo." Izuku felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd been terrified of showing his room to the beautiful frog girl since they'd become official, afraid that she'd find the medical memorabilia off-putting or the presence of the plushies a turn-off. "You're very kind and caring, Izuku-kun," Hugh added, a sudden feeling of hot static crackling from the two's joined hands and shooting to her stomach. A hazy idea began to form in the amphibious teen's mind. "You've got a heart of gold, and you're really intelligent too. Honestly, I really don't want to share you with anyone else, Karo." The familiar feeling of prickling behind his eyes clued Izuku in that he was about to cry, not that the warm, fuzzy swelling in his chest hadn't already given him a hint. He'd only ever felt this happy around his Tsu-chan. It was something the green-haired teen would never get tired of. "And you know, even though my family's always valued traits such as intelligence over conventionally desirable physical appearances," Tsu said, pausing as she came to a decision. She couldn't ignore the heat any longer. Slowly, the frog girl guided her boyfriend's hand, the one that had been draped over her shoulder, to her chest. "There are times when we enjoy the physical as well, Karo." Instantly, Izuku felt his face catch fire and his heart race. His blood was literally singing in his veins. None of that helped him decide on what to do. The green-haired teen now had a hand comfortably resting on his beautiful girlfriend's breast, the covered mound of flesh ample and soft, and yet, his brain was short-circuiting. A part of him wanted to squeeze, a primal part that roared for him to do even more that very second. Another part cried out for him to flee and escape the situation before they were caught, and he was branded a pervert. An incredibly small part was mature enough to advise him to enjoy the situation as it came, but to not push farther until the two had a chance to talk about it. In the end, the frazzled hero in training settled on locking eyes with the bold frog girl. "Love you," Izuku squeaked out, immediately coughing through the embarrassing vocal tic. The adorable blush that bloomed across his girlfriend's face did much to comfort the fumbling green-haired teen. "I mean, I love you, Tsuchan. I love everything about you." With Tay lying on the floor, silently munching on the head of her All Might plush, and Lily quietly braiding the hair of her fluffy unicorn, there was no one readily available to disturb the verdant couple from falling into their very own second of eternity. The stares the two shared turned flirty, as did the smiles. After a minute of basking in the love radiating from each other, Izuku and Tsu closed the distance and connected lips. The kissing started off slow, sweet, and innocent. Inevitably, passion leaked out, and as simple kissing turned to making out, Izuku began to gently knead the breast in his hand, while Tsu slowly inched her own hand up his leg. The frog girl gasped as she felt. What is the fucking meaning of this? The vulgar screech was accompanied by Saki's entrance, the blonde skidding into Izuku's room at a full run. "Naked. Why are they fucking disappearing?" Saki continued shouting, pointing at several spots on her nude form, apparently unbothered by her state of undress. "Where the fuck are my badges of honor going?" What? What are you talking about?" Izuku shouted right back, completely confused by what was going on. The green-haired teen might have had more luck understanding had Tsu not been doing her best to cover his eyes with her hands. This was not the outcome the frog girl had hoped for after she'd sat through at least 10 declarations of the delinquent swearing that she didn't find Izuku the least a bit attractive. When the blonde had requested permission to take a shower, the amphibious teen had been all too happy when Inko had shown the loudmouth where the bathroom was. She knew the two Midoriya probably felt for the rebellious zombie girl, imagining Saki felt horrible for being dead and still having to go through a debriefing and an autopsy, and that was fine. Admirable even. But Tsu had been afraid of something like this happening. "I'm not one of you perfect fucking dolls, damn it." Saki continued to rage, flailing her arms around. "I'm me. You better not lay a fucking finger on the scar my first boyfriend gave me." That last shout actually stunned everyone in the room. Then, like a homely saint, Inko appeared, silently grabbing the rebellious zombie girl by the ear and dragging her away, kicking and screaming. The woman marched down the hall with not a little anger visible on her face. Although whether this was due to the blonde's choice of words or the fact that she'd interrupted the verdant couple, none could tell. "Are you two all right?" Karo, Baru asked, suddenly stepping into the room. The frog woman's face was twisted in obvious concern. "Was there violence?" "We're fine," Tsu replied, content in knowing that even if her cinnamon roll had suffered a heart attack, it wouldn't have really threatened his health. Just a little startled, Karo. In truth, what really worried Izuku was Baru's appearance in his room. He was still hugging the fearsome woman's daughter, and in fact had only moments ago been groping her. The green-haired teen began to panic when the frog woman began to look around, analyzing everything she could see. He grew especially nervous when her eyes landed on one of his bookshelves. "Do you actually understand this?" Karo, Baru asked, picking up a published dissertation on advanced neurology. Izuku really didn't know how to explain that. Wednesday, Ministry of Justice. In a truly massive building of wood-paneled halls and resonant courtrooms, Izuku and his zombie girls sat waiting in a special holding room. None of the group had ever had cause to step foot in the labyrinthine structure before, but today was the day of a trial especially close to the green-haired teen's heart. It was the day of the trial that would bring justice to Izuku's littlest and cutest assistant, Lily. "How are you feeling, Masao?" Takeo asked, his large frame squeezed into the chair next to his child. By some miracle, the mountainous man had managed to regain enough of his composure to be allowed to enter the Ministry of Justice. I don't like these clothes," Lily replied, pouting. The normally bubbly zombie child had been forced to dress in drab boy clothes for the day and was openly unhappy. The Blueonette hated that she'd died before being old enough to file the paperwork that would officially make her a girl in the eyes of the law. "I don't look cute at all." The past few days had been gloriously relaxing for the boy with the cursed blood, if you could call intensive police training relaxing. The green-haired teen had danced through paperwork lessons and protocol rundowns like they were already second nature to him. He'd stood in during evidence compilation a number of times at various crime scenes, even aiding in the discovery of a hidden clue in one case using his advanced deduction skills. He'd even been promised a walkthrough of how to handle a forensics kit tomorrow. The surprise crash course in self-defense had been an unexpected blessing. Structured lessons had allowed the green-haired teen to come up with new ideas on how to combat villains and capture criminals more efficiently. Surprisingly, Lily had come to be quite happy as well. The littlest zombie had been loved by pretty much the whole station and had taken a liking to watching the tech team as they toiled away. When the Bluinette had showed signs of being skilled at computer work, she'd cited how she'd always watched her pappy when he'd worked, becoming curious about the technology early on in life. According to the officers, Lily was a natural when it came to handling databases, networks, and even search engine software. "Don't worry, it'll only be for today," Takeo reassured, taking a moment to re-examine his own uncomfortable garb. The formal suit the large man wore was nothing like the slacks he normally dressed in. "And remember, no idle speech either. Normal talking today." I know," Lily grumbled, sounding extremely dejected. "Nothing cute today at all." Seeing that his precious child was miserable, Takeo reached for any idea that could hopefully lift Masao's spirits. "Don't be sad," the scarred father said, putting on his best smile. "How about some ice cream after all this is over?" Though the smile had no effect on the littlest zombie, Takeo did have a reason to be happy. Before leaving the police station on Saturday, Izuku had heard the news too, and by Sunday it had become public knowledge, causing a massive uproar. A circle of the rich elite had been arrested after caught committing acts of pedophilia en masse. When she'd heard the descriptions of those taken into custody, Lily had confirmed that the men who'd abused her were among those caught. There were, of course, other factors that made this case different than past cases where the rich and powerful were arrested and then let go with a slap to the wrist. This time the bastards had been caught red-handed and recorded on video by a multitude of witnesses, namely the anti-riot unit that had busted into their party room, weapons drawn, and the high-profile reporter that had somehow known to hide away in a closet and film them in action. The greasy old men and slimy younger men had been found groping and undressing kidnapped children, all from the local area, after a spokesman had given a toast to the group. The men had cheered to the tune of once again having evaded the law and succeeded in enjoying their privilege with no limits. Denials of such were impossible when the reporter revealed herself and offered her camera's footage to the arresting officers on the spot. The video evidence was sickening, but its existence was oh so satisfying to those who knew how slippery the entitled could be. With evidence piling up to the magnitude of an avalanche, all the bastards involved had their assets immediately frozen, law enforcement citing the use of which would have made their suspects flight risks. A little-known prior ruling by the Ministry of Justice decades ago additionally put these assets up for confiscation pending the result of the trial, a bit of righteous compensation to families affected by a criminal's actions. Effectively, a guilty verdict would leave the monsters arrested homeless and without a penny to their names. The normally loyal, albeit sleazy, lawyers who represented the group of bastards had also bailed out immediately, citing no prior knowledge of their clients' illicit activities and an unwillingness to tarnish the names of their firms by representing such filth. Baru Ajui had publicly scoffed at such a declaration and had stated the more likely cause of the abandonment was to avoid friendly fire. The frog woman had then offhandedly stated in another interview that she would suggest a thorough audit of the firms regardless. All of this meant a great many things for Lily, not the least of which was the ability to move about without fear of encountering the bastards again. However, there was still a bit of a legal issue surrounding the Bluinette. "Sir, while I don't oppose such an outing, I must remind you that." Izuku trailed off, failing to find a gentle enough way to explain to the enormous father that he couldn't just let Lily run around on her own. He'd been appointed her handler, just as he had with Tay. Due to Lily's feral episode, and the extensive report Izuku had submitted clarifying why he believed it had happened, the QRA had deemed any zombie created by the green-haired teen's quirk as potentially dangerous, with the only other options being letting the agency take the undead away or putting them down. The hero in training had earned the title of official handler and had been ordered to supervise his creatures at all times, as if he were handling some type of feral animal. "I know," Takeo barked, his hatred for the boy who'd enslaved his sweet Masao peeking through. It galled the man that the same teen was, by law, allowed to sleep in the same room as his baby. Don't expect any ice cream from me, though. Pappy, it doesn't have to comply to your demands, you know. Lily snapped at her father. He's being nice enough to let you take me out, so don't be mean to him. I can still say no to your request. The group fell silent as the littlest zombie put her foot down, both metaphorically and literally. It was a great example to those who were in the know of how the Bluinette was beginning to stand up for herself. Being taken under the wing of the Ajui women and having the situation with her father explained to her probably had something to do with that. The room's door suddenly opened, and a couple of police officers Izuku had met at the Muzutafu precinct over the last few days entered. The green-haired teen was thankful for small miracles. It's time, one of the officers announced, earning understanding nods from Izuku and Lily. Takeo huffed, remaining seated as his little Masao walked away. As he was still classified as emotionally unstable, he'd been barred from the courtroom. Saki, true to her reputation as a delinquent, scoffed and slouched further in her chair before the urge to follow her new boss became too strong. The blonde had nothing to do with the case currently on trial, so she'd been told to come along, but stay in the gallery as an observer. Tay, completely silent, rose and accompanied her master, his shadow as always. It was agreed upon by those in charge, with a word from Baru as well, that attempts to separate her from Izuku would be the worst choice anyone could make. Ministry of Justice, Courtroom 4J. Ichigo Go, second wife of renowned scientist Takeo Go, was not a happy woman. When her freak of a stepchild's corpse hadn't been cremated as she'd ordered, she'd only thought something had gone wrong with her plans. When she hadn't been able to get a hold of Takeo since destroying the fool with the news of his child's suicide, she'd known she was going to have it rough. When she tried to book a flight out of Japan, only to get arrested while packing her things, she'd realized she was in real trouble. A whole year's work, gone to waste, and she had no idea what had happened. The job had hardly sounded difficult on the surface, just a simple espionage request from a client who'd wanted to get their hands on the most recent research data of one Takeo Go. The approach had followed Ichigo's usual modus operandi. She'd casually gotten to know her target, had become his closest confidant, and then had seduced him. When she'd learned of Go's dead wife, and the brat he still had that was in dire need of a mother figure, she'd believed she'd struck gold. It had only taken 4 months of dating after her first seduction for Ichigo to believe she'd gotten her target in her pocket, although that hadn't been enough to grant her access to his data. By that point, she'd realized how sentimental the oaf was, and had decided marrying him might be enough to give her limited access to his research. She'd been right. However, the files she'd needed had turned out to be encrypted as well as secured on Go's laptop, special software rendering the data untransferable. Once she discovered that, Ichigo had hatched her final plan. Keeping tabs on Go's cross-dressing freak of a child as she had been, Ichigo had known that the brat was striking gold in the idol industry at the time. Manipulating her fool of a husband into traveling overseas for one last experiment before retiring to become Masao's manager had been child's play. She'd even managed to convince Masao to agree to Go's trip, citing the extra money brought in would prevent financial hardships as his career took off as Lily Hashikawa. After Go had left, the rest was simple. She'd sold Masao to a contact of hers for some extra cash, and when the animals he'd then been gifted to had ended up strangling the freak as she'd known they would, she'd used her rights as stepmother to demand immediate cremation before anyone would have had a chance to claim foul play. Immediately after doing so, she'd called Go, laying into the man and blaming him for his precious baby committing suicide. Knowing the inconsolable scientist would likely follow his child into death, Ichigo had been all set to leave the country with her husband's work in hand. She'd already been dreaming of the payout too. An early retirement maybe, spending obscene amounts of money on anything her heart desired. The possibilities were endless. Well, they had been. Now Ichigo found herself sitting before the most feared judge in Japan, anxiously waiting for the prosecution's surprise witness to arrive and place the final nail in her coffin. Her entire plan had been deconstructed in minutes, with evidence, and she couldn't imagine who could make her situation any worse. Although, the woman that stared at her so dispassionately from the bench didn't appear to need much more to do so. Hanabi Hyuga, known most recently as the final judge, sat and glared at the piece of trash, barely keeping itself from cowering. The charges against it, and the evidence shown, had been monstrous to be sure, and unforgivably cruel beyond doubt. The slightly graying woman itched to use her quirk, Eye of Truth, on the bitch for even now standing by a non-guilty plea, but she knew she couldn't, not yet. Her quirk, as powerful as it was, had always been heavily restricted, the higher-ups in the government not wanting her abilities' single hour of use to be wasted. They despise going a month with her out of commission nowadays, unless it was a result of taking on the most heinous of villains or the most scandalous of crimes. And somehow, that list had come to include the case of one Ichigo Go's. I've heard enough to send this person behind bars for the rest of their natural life, Hanabi stated, strong voice echoing throughout the courtroom. The disgust and contempt she clearly felt for the filth before her likewise echoed. Ichigo had the decency to flinch. However, the circumstances of this final witness are such that I feel justice would not be properly served until we've all heard what they have to say. Crushing silence pervaded the courtroom, all attending holding their breath in anticipation. Trials attended by the final judge were always historic, not the least of which being because while the rulings involved usually rocked society, they were also always forbidden from being recorded by the media. Everyone knew Hanabi Hyuga had a quirk that had something to do with the ultimate revelation of truth, but no one knew how it worked. The Ministry of Justice worked tirelessly to keep it that way too. Officials feared showing the quirk's mechanics to the public would give criminals or even lawyers ideas on how to evade it. This effort and reasoning, however, certainly didn't stop unscrupulous reporters from attempting to sneak in cameras. Those that were successful were given incredibly harsh sentences afterwards, even if so far they'd never managed to direct their hidden recorders toward the final judge herself. Even with that knowledge in mind, a certain reporter of dubious morals was even now sitting in the gallery with hidden camera at the ready. She was going to film the new arrival, find out what was going on, and sell this scandalous trial to the highest bidding station for more than she'd ever dreamed of. For the first time in the history of this honorable court, Hanabi began, hesitating as she steeled herself for what was about to happen. The murder victim themselves will be called to testify. Murmuring exploded. A cry or two of shock cracked through the air. Confusion prevailed. Ichigo Go nearly had a heart attack. Within minutes, half the courtroom was sure the final judge had misread the docket, while the other half jumped straight to the only sane conclusion, which was that little Masao Go had actually survived and was now ready to testify. Ichigo knew differently than either camp though, having had to make sure the freak was completely dead before sending him to be cremated. For her part, Hanabi felt a slight nervousness for a completely different reason than the now rowdy courtroom she was presided over. She was about to use her quirk, and when she did, she'd be shown the truth. When someone described an event to her with her quirk activated, she would see the events themselves as they happened. Whether or not she was told the complete happenings or biased remembering, she would always see what actually occurred, her viewpoint completely objective. It once made her the best prosecutor in Japan. It now made her the best judge. But besides the month-long cool-down period, her quirk also put her under a massive amount of mental strain. Knowing that any minute she would be watching the final moments of Masao Go ate away at Hanabi's sanity. Observing atrocities she could do nothing to stop had always affected her, but when children were involved it always seemed worse. The giant double doors to the courtroom opened, and silence once more reigned supreme. A pair of officers in full uniform appeared, escorting 3 teens. Between the trio followed a child. 2 unanimous thoughts crossed the minds of those lucky few sitting in the gallery at that moment. The first was that the child, surely Masao Go, didn't look dead. The other was why were 3 random teenagers suddenly involved? Ichigo Go's heart was a hair's breadth from completely stopping. By the grace of some black magic fuckery, Masao was right there, walking to the witness stand. Doing her best to hide her panic, the woman began to look around. If she couldn't escape, was there anything she could do to stop the freak from getting her sent to Tartarus? It was at times like these that Ichigo cursed her parents for birthing a daughter whose quirk was only the ability to harmlessly unbutton, well, buttons. Called to testify on behalf of the prosecution, Masao Go. In mandatory attendance, her handler, Izuku Midoriya. The prosecutor's proclamation sent the courtroom into another whispering fit. Izuku led Lily through the shifting crowd, wishing that the Azui matriarch could have been there. Unfortunately, due to their closeness, Baru had felt it better she remain on the sidelines. As the green-haired teen marched toward the witness stand with his partners, Saki grumpily seating herself in the back of the gallery, the whispers of the crowd grew louder. At the same time, the woman being judged became even more restless, and the imposing judge watching it all appeared to gaze down on them all with a look of sadness. Before we begin, Hanabi called as Lily hopped into the witness's seat. Midoriya-san, I would appreciate asking you a few questions as well. Izuku took conscious control of his blood again, ordering it to devour anything his body produced that might exacerbate his anxiety. Even then, he could only just respond coherently. Of course, Your Honor, Izuku replied, glad he could manage to do so without stuttering. Fortunately, none in attendance noticed as his eyes changed from emeralds to rubies. I'll answer everything to the best of my abilities. Hanabi nodded, riffling through the papers littering her bench. Soon enough, she found the files pertaining to her witness and the quirk that had been used to bring him back to life to testify. Honestly, it creeped her out. First of all, and most importantly, Hanabi began, reading over the information in front of her a dozen times in quick succession, but unable to process it to her liking. Is the victim, Masao Go, fully capable of answering questions relating to the events of his zombification? As one, those in the gallery paled at the words spoken. Izuku nodded to Lily, now wordlessly sitting at the witness stand. Ichigo Go stared intently at the court officer positioned next to her, or more specifically, the security strap keeping his gun holstered at his side. I can, Your Honor, Lily replied, showcasing her full cognizance and control of her actions. I also remember everything from when I was alive and how I died. A handful of attendees stepped out of the courtroom, racing to the nearest trash cans as they fought the urge to vomit. Hanabi visibly suppressed a wince at the words. The safety strap at the court officer's hip came undone. I see, Hanabi said, swallowing hard. There were many questions she wished she could ask now, especially those relating to the morality of turning a child into an undead creature. However, the stamp of the QRA on the documents, the bastards, stopped her. Midoriya-san, why are you described as the handler of these people? If it were only the Ravenet beside Midoriya, Hanabi would have had no problem describing the undead the green-haired teen had raised as creatures. Watching as Masao squirmed in his seat, though, and taking his previous answer into account, it was clear the child had his own free will, and labeling a clearly sentient child a creature would have been inhuman of her. The empty eyes of the other zombie girl were too unsettling to ignore, though. Izuku nodded, sighing in resignation. He knew he'd have to explain the unfortunate circumstances of his quirk's control aspect, and why his partners could go feral outside of his presence. One day, he'd just hoped it wouldn't have had to be so public. Well, there was no. Bang! Lily's head snapped back, a bullet tearing through her cheek and exploding out the back of her skull. Ichigo Go made her move. The now crazed woman had decided she wouldn't let a freak of a child take her down. In sheer desperation, she'd used her quirk, stealing the pistol of the court officer guarding her. Taking aim at the brunette who was seconds away from ruining her life for good, she readily pulled the trigger. She'd take another murder charge over being connected to those bastards slated for Tartarus. She knew she wouldn't survive long if they were tied together. It happened too quickly for most to react. Bang, 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 bang. In seconds, Ichigo Go had unloaded almost an entire clip into the chest of her target. Then, she turned and aimed at the final judge. Bang! Izuku stumbled to the ground, the hero in training having jumped in front of the flinching Hanabi. Instantly, Tae was on the gun-toting woman. Before she could blink, the Ravenet had grabbed her by the arm holding the gun and snapped it like a twig. Once dead, eyes now blazing in absolute hatred, the oldest zombie girl pulled with all her might and ripped the limb from her master's assailant. Aor guard. Wham! Ichigo Go's blood-curdling scream was cut off as the enraged zombie girl smacked her with her own dismembered limb. Trying to compose herself, Hanabi Hyuga stared in disbelieving shock at the two young citizens who'd been killed on her watch, right in front of her. A boiling anger began to build within the normally stoic woman's chest, and she raggedly pulled in a lungful of air to shout for security when Oni-chan Masao popped up from where he'd been slumped against his seat. In the blink of an eye, the child had run to the fallen form of the one he'd called Big Brother. To the growing horror of the older woman, the Bluinette did all of this with a chest full of bullets. Ugh! Hanabi's horror only intensified as the green-haired teen who'd saved her life grunted as he stood up. "I'm fine." Izuku groaned before retching. Mixed in with bloody vomit pinged a single bullet. "But I'm beginning to hate when that happens." The surreality of watching a teen who'd just taken a bullet stand as if nothing had happened was almost too much. The fact that quirks gave many members of the populace increased durability, the only thing keeping many of the remaining attendees from breaking. Many heroes were bulletproof after all, and it wasn't like the bullet had hit the green-haired boy in the head. Right? Hey, stop that already. Izuku shouted at his first partner. The Ravenette promptly ceased her rampage, even dropping the limb she'd been using as a club to beat the woman who'd hurt her master. As if a switch had been flipped, the zombie girl fell into place at the green-haired teen's side, looking as innocent and harmless as ever. Izuku was exceedingly grateful as he looked around that none of this was being recorded. There was no way his mother would handle this well if she knew any of it happened. From her seat in the gallery, Saki Nikaido looked at the green being who, for all intents and purposes, was her master now, and began to change her opinion of him. Chaos seemed to follow the nerd, so maybe she'd actually find some fun following him. The reporter who'd succeeded in sneaking in a hidden camera couldn't believe her luck. She'd just struck more gold than she'd ever expected. If she sold this, the pandemonium it would cause would raise her paycheck through the roof. Hell was about to break loose in central Japan, and the green-haired necromancer would be at the center of it all. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed Support the Writer. Don't forget to like, sub, and share.